Tonight, we will discover the ancient art of letting go through the gentle wisdom of Zen Buddhism. We will walk together through quiet teachings and simple stories of ordinary people who discovered extraordinary freedom. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. You don't need to understand everything we explore together tonight. Just listen. Each tale is a doorway to the peace that comes when we stop fighting what life offers. Gently close your eyes if you haven't already. Let your breathing find its own rhythm. As we journey together through these teachings, let go of needing to remember everything or apply it perfectly. Simply receive what speaks to you and let the rest flow past like water in a stream. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin our journey together. In the mountains of ancient China, there was a village where order mattered above all else. The houses stood in perfect rows. The gardens followed precise patterns. Even the chickens seemed to know exactly where they belonged. This harmony was the life's work of Administrator Chen, a man who believed that proper organization could solve any problem and prevent any suffering. Chen had served the village for 15 years, and during that time he had created rules for everything. When to plant rice and when to harvest it. Where merchants could set up their stalls and for how long. Which paths people should take to the well and which direction they should walk around the temple. He had schedules for festivals, regulations for marriages, and detailed procedures for settling the smallest disputes. The villagers respected Chen's dedication. Under his careful management, their community had prospered. Crops grew in orderly fields. Trade flowed smoothly through organized markets. Children learned their lessons according to structured plans. Everything had its proper place and time. But one spring, the rains came differently than they had for many years. Instead of gentle showers that soaked the fields gradually, heavy storms arrived in bursts, followed by unexpected dry spells. Chen's carefully planned planting schedule, based on decades of previous weather patterns, no longer matched what the sky was actually doing. Some farmers wanted to plant early during the first heavy rain. Others preferred to wait for more predictable conditions. A few suggested planting different crops altogether, varieties that could handle irregular water better. But Chen's regulations were clear. Everyone must plant rice on the appointed day using the approved method in the designated areas. As the unusual weather continued, problems began to multiply. The rice planted according to schedule struggled in the inconsistent conditions. Meanwhile, wild grasses and flowers that had no schedule to follow seemed to thrive in the strange weather, growing thick and green in places where they had never been abundant before. Chen worked longer hours trying to manage these difficulties. He created new rules to address each problem as it arose. Special watering schedules for the struggling crops. Revised market hours to accommodate farmers dealing with unexpected challenges. Additional regulations about which plants could grow where and when they should be removed. But the more rules he created, the more complicated life became for everyone. Farmers spent as much time checking regulations as they did tending their fields. Merchants arrived to find that market rules had changed again overnight. Children missed lessons because their families were busy trying to follow the latest administrative requirements. One morning, Chen stood in the village center surveying the growing chaos despite his best efforts to control it. An old woman named Grandmother Wu, who had lived in the village longer than anyone could remember, approached him with a cup of tea. "Administrator Chen," she said gently, "You look tired." "There is much to organize," Chen replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "The weather has disrupted all our careful plans. I must find a way to restore proper order. May I tell you something I have noticed?" Grandmother Wu asked. Chen nodded, though his attention was partly focused on a group of farmers who were not following the designated path to the fields. "I have watched this village for 70 years, she continued. "I have seen many springs with unusual weather. Each time, the people and the land find their own way to work together. But this spring feels different." "Different how?" "Usually when problems arise, people help each other figure out solutions. They share information about what is working and what is not. They try new approaches when old ones fail. But this spring, everyone keeps asking what the rules say instead of paying attention to what the land and weather are actually doing." Chen felt a flash of irritation. Without proper guidelines, people make poor decisions. They waste effort on approaches that have not been proven. Order prevents chaos. "Does it?" Grandmother Wu asked softly. "Look around. Is there more order now or less than when the strange weather began?" Chen looked more carefully at the scene before him. Despite all his additional regulations, the village did seem more chaotic than usual. People stood in confused groups trying to understand the latest requirements. Farmers waited for official permission to take actions they knew were needed immediately. Children played in scattered, aimless ways because their usual activities had been disrupted by changing schedules. "But without structure, everything would fall apart," Chen insisted. "Perhaps," Grandmother Wu said. "Or perhaps there are different kinds of order. The order that comes from rules imposed from outside, and the order that emerges when people respond naturally to changing conditions." She pointed to a corner of the village where Chen had recently forbidden people to gather because it interfered with his traffic flow plan. "Do you see what is growing there now?" Chen looked and saw that wildflowers had sprouted in the unused space. Their bright colors created a cheerful spot that several villagers had begun to visit quietly, though technically they were not supposed to be there. "Those flowers have no schedule," Grandmother Wu continued. "No one told them where to grow or when to bloom. Yet they have created beauty in a place that was empty before." Over the following days, Chen found himself thinking about this conversation. He began to notice things he had been too busy organizing to see before. How farmers naturally shared tools and knowledge when regulations did not prevent them from gathering. How children created elaborate games when they were not confined to structured activities. How merchants developed efficient systems for fair trading when they could respond immediately to changing conditions rather than waiting for official approval. Slowly, carefully, Chen began an experiment. He lifted some of his newer regulations, particularly those created in response to the unusual weather. Instead of requiring farmers to follow the predetermined planting schedule, he allowed them to plant when conditions seemed right to them. Instead of dictating market hours, he let merchants and customers find times that worked for their actual needs. At first, Chen felt deeply anxious watching this apparent disorder unfold. Farmers planted at different times. Market activity happened in unexpected rhythms. Children's learning happened in various places throughout the village rather than only in the designated school area. But as days passed, something surprising emerged. The farmers who planted according to their reading of actual conditions had better success with their crops than those who had followed the prescribed schedule. Markets that operated flexibly attracted more traders and generated more prosperity. Children who learned through natural curiosity and play seemed to retain more knowledge than those confined to rigid lesson plans. Most remarkably, the village began to feel harmonious again, but in a different way than before. Instead of the rigid uniformity that Chen's rules had created, there was a flowing cooperation that adapted naturally to changing circumstances. One evening, as Chen walked through the village and observed this emerging order, he experienced something that would change his approach to administration forever. Watching a group of farmers share knowledge about which seeds worked best in the current conditions, seeing children teach each other games that helped them learn counting and cooperation, witnessing merchants arrange their stalls in patterns that naturally accommodated both sellers and buyers, Chen suddenly understood what Grandmother Wu had meant. True order was not something imposed from outside, but something that emerged when people were free to respond wisely to actual conditions. His role was not to control every detail, but to create space for natural cooperation to flourish. The realization struck him so clearly that he stopped walking and simply stood in the village center, feeling a weight he had not known he was carrying begin to lift from his shoulders. For 15 years, he had been trying to force life into predetermined patterns. Now, he could see that life had its own intelligent patterns that worked better than anything he could design. From that day forward, Chen's approach to village administration transformed completely. Instead of creating detailed rules for every situation, he focused on maintaining basic principles that supported people in making their own wise decisions. Instead of solving every problem through regulation, he helped people develop their own problem-solving capabilities. Instead of controlling outcomes, he created conditions that allowed positive outcomes to emerge naturally. The village continued to prosper, but now its success felt sustainable and alive rather than rigid and fragile. When new challenges arose, the community could adapt flexibly rather than waiting for administrative solutions. People took more responsibility for their own choices and showed more consideration for their neighbors because they were not focused on following external rules. Years later, when other administrators visited to learn from Chen's success, he would tell them that the hardest lesson he had learned was the difference between creating order and allowing order to emerge. "I thought control meant determining how everything should happen," he would explain. But real control means creating space for natural wisdom to operate. When you stop trying to control everything, you discover that life organizes itself more intelligently than you ever could. This story shows us something profound about the nature of control in our own lives. Like Administrator Chen, we often believe that managing every detail will create security and success. We make elaborate plans for how things should unfold. We try to eliminate uncertainty by predicting and preparing for every possibility. We create internal rules about how we should think, feel, and behave in various situations. But as Chen discovered, excessive control often creates the very problems it attempts to solve. When we grip too tightly to our plans, we cannot adapt when conditions change. When we insist that life follow our timeline, we miss opportunities that arise unexpectedly. When we try to control our thoughts and emotions rigidly, we create internal tension that makes natural peace impossible. Zen Buddhism teaches that much of our suffering comes from believing we can and should control outcomes. This belief makes us anxious when things do not go according to plan. It makes us exhausted from constantly trying to manage circumstances that are partly or completely beyond our influence. It prevents us from responding skillfully to what is actually happening because we are so focused on making things happen as we think they should. Letting go of control does not mean becoming passive or careless. Administrator Chen did not abandon his responsibilities when he learned to work with natural order rather than against it. Instead, he discovered more effective ways to fulfill his role by creating conditions that supported people's natural wisdom rather than suppressing it. In your own life, letting go of control means distinguishing between what you can influence and what you cannot. You can choose your actions, but you cannot determine their outcomes. You can offer your best effort, but you cannot guarantee specific results. You can create conditions that support what you value, but you cannot force those values to manifest exactly as you envision. This recognition brings tremendous relief. Instead of carrying the impossible burden of making everything turn out right, you can focus your energy on responding wisely to whatever actually occurs. Instead of fighting circumstances that have already happened, you can work skillfully with present conditions. Instead of demanding that uncertainty become certainty, you can learn to move forward confidently, despite not knowing exactly what comes next. In another part of the mountains, there lived a potter named Queske, who had learned his craft from his father and grandfather before him. His family had been making ceramics for generations, creating bowls, cups, and vases that were valued throughout the region for their beauty and durability. Queske took great pride in continuing this tradition and had spent years mastering the techniques passed down through his lineage. But Queske had developed an obsession with perfection that made his work increasingly difficult and frustrating. He would envision exactly how each piece should look before he began, planning every curve and proportion in precise detail. When the clay did not respond exactly as he intended, when a bowl's rim was slightly uneven or a vase's shape was not perfectly symmetrical, he would often destroy his work and start over. His workshop was filled with fragments of broken pottery, pieces that had been close to completion but had failed to meet his exacting standards. Queske would spend entire days creating and destroying, growing more frustrated with each imperfect result. The clay itself seemed to resist his efforts to control it completely. Despite his skill and experience, the material would behave unpredictably. Sometimes it would be too soft, collapsing under the pressure of his precise shaping. Other times it would be too stiff, cracking when he tried to form it into his predetermined vision. The humidity, the temperature, the clay's particular composition that day all affected how it responded to his touch. Queske began to see the clay as his adversary, something to be conquered and forced into submission. He tried different techniques to gain more control. Special tools that would give him more precise shaping ability. Additives that would make the clay more predictable in its behavior. Rigid schedules that would eliminate variables in temperature and humidity. But the more he tried to control every aspect of the process, the more his pottery seemed to lack life and soul. Even when he managed to create pieces that matched his mental plans exactly, they felt cold and lifeless compared to the warm, vital ceramics his father and grandfather had made. One day, a traveling monk named Brother Jishin arrived in the village and visited Queske's workshop. He admired the technical skill evident in the completed pieces, but noticed the great pile of broken pottery fragments in the corner. "You must work very hard," Brother Jishin observed. "I see evidence of much effort here." "Too much effort for too little success," Queske replied bitterly. "The clay will not do what I want it to do. No matter how carefully I plan each piece, something always goes wrong." "May I watch you work?" the monk asked. Queske agreed, though he felt self-conscious about his struggles. As he began shaping a new bowl, Brother Jishin observed quietly. Queske's hands were tense with concentration. His jaw was tight with determination. Every movement was controlled and deliberate, trying to force the clay into the exact shape he had visualized. When the bowl's rim began to waver slightly from his intended perfect circle, Queske's frustration became visible. His movements became more forceful, trying to correct the clay's deviation from his plan. The more he fought to control the shape, the more the clay seemed to resist, until finally the bowl collapsed entirely. "This always happens," Queske said, staring at the ruined clay. "I can see exactly how it should look, but the material will not cooperate." Brother Jishin was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "When you were learning this craft as a child, watching your father work, what did you notice about his hands?" Keisuke thought back to those early memories. His hands moved very smoothly. He seemed to dance with the clay rather than fight it. But he was a master. He had earned the right to that ease through decades of experience. "And how did his finished pieces look compared to what you are trying to create?" This question made Keisuke pause. His father's bowls and vases had never been perfectly symmetrical. If you measured them precisely, you would find small variations, gentle irregularities that somehow made them more beautiful rather than less. They had a quality of life and warmth that Keisuke's technically perfect pieces lacked. "They were beautiful," Queske admitted. "More beautiful than anything I make, even when I succeed in controlling the shape exactly." "What if the clay is not your enemy?" Brother Jishin suggested gently. "What if it is your partner in creating something that neither of you could make alone?" That afternoon, Queske tried an experiment. Instead of beginning with a rigid mental image of how his pot should look, he simply placed his hands on the clay and began to feel its particular qualities that day. This clay was a bit softer than usual, with a texture that suggested it might want to flow in slightly curved forms rather than straight lines. Instead of forcing it into his predetermined design, Queske allowed his hands to respond to what the clay seemed to offer. When it wanted to lean slightly to one side, instead of correcting it immediately, he explored whether that lean might create an interesting asymmetry. When the rim naturally formed into a shape that was different from what he had planned, he considered whether this new shape might be more beautiful than his original intention. For the first time in months, Queske found himself truly enjoying the process of pottery making. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing deepened. His hands moved with a fluidity he had not experienced since he became obsessed with perfect control. The bowl that emerged from this collaboration between potter and clay was unlike anything Keisuke had made before. It was not perfectly symmetrical, but its gentle irregularities gave it a quality of liveliness and grace. The rim had a subtle wave that made drinking from it a pleasure. The proportions were different from what he had planned, but they felt harmonious and natural. As Queske lifted the completed bowl and felt its weight in his hands, something shifted profoundly in his understanding of his craft. He realized that his greatest creations would come not from imposing his will upon the clay, but from learning to dance with its natural properties. The clay had its own wisdom about form and function that could enhance rather than threaten his artistic vision. This moment of insight changed not only his pottery, but his entire approach to creative work. Instead of seeing materials as obstacles to overcome, he began to view them as collaborators with their own valuable contributions to make. Instead of demanding that his vision be realized exactly as conceived, he learned to allow his vision to evolve through interaction with the physical world. His pottery improved dramatically. Pieces that emerged from this collaborative approach had a quality of natural beauty that his controlled work had never achieved. They felt alive in the hands, comfortable to use, pleasing to look at from any angle. Other potters began to seek his advice, wondering how he had developed such mastery. "I learned to let the clay teach me," Queske would tell them. "I stopped trying to make pottery and started allowing pottery to emerge through the meeting of my skills with the clay's nature. The greatest beauty comes from this cooperation, not from conquest." Years later, when Queske had become known as one of the finest potters in the mountains, he would demonstrate his technique to students by showing them first how to feel the clay's particular qualities before beginning to shape it. "Each piece of clay is different," he would explain. "Each day brings different conditions of humidity and temperature. If you try to make the same pot every time, you fight against these natural variations. But if you learn to work with them, they become your allies in creating something more beautiful than you could plan alone." Queske's story teaches us about a different relationship with control in creative endeavors and daily life. Like the potter learning to work with clay rather than against it, we can learn to work with circumstances rather than demanding that they conform to our predetermined plans. This does not mean abandoning our intentions or becoming completely passive. Queske still brought skill, knowledge, and artistic vision to his pottery making. But he learned to hold his intentions lightly, allowing them to evolve through interaction with reality rather than insisting that reality conform exactly to his initial ideas. In Zen tradition, this is sometimes called effortless effort, or action without force. It means applying your skills and energy fully while remaining open to outcomes that differ from your expectations. Like water flowing around rocks in a stream, this approach finds the most natural path forward rather than trying to force a direct route that ignores existing conditions. This principle applies to many areas of life. In relationships, instead of trying to control how others think or behave, we can learn to work skillfully with people as they actually are. In work, instead of rigidly following plans that circumstances have made obsolete, we can adapt our approach while maintaining our core objectives. In personal growth, instead of forcing ourselves to change according to arbitrary timelines, we can work patiently with our natural rhythms of development. The potter's transformation from fighting the clay to dancing with it shows how much energy becomes available when we stop wasting it on impossible control. Queske's work became less effortful and more effective once he learned to collaborate with natural forces rather than oppose them. Notice how this principle appears in your own breathing. You do not control each breath by conscious decision, yet breathing serves your life perfectly. When you try to control your breathing too rigidly, it becomes uncomfortable and inefficient. But when you allow your body's natural wisdom to guide the rhythm while maintaining awareness, breathing becomes both effortless and nourishing. This same balance between intention and release can guide your approach to daily challenges. You can set clear goals while remaining flexible about how those goals are achieved. You can work diligently while accepting that results may differ from expectations. You can care deeply about outcomes while finding satisfaction in the quality of your effort, regardless of specific results. The deepest teaching in both stories is that letting go of control often leads to better outcomes than grasping for control ever could. Administrator Chen discovered that allowing natural order to emerge created more harmony than imposed regulations. Potter Queske found that collaborating with his materials produced more beautiful art than forcing them into predetermined shapes. This paradox appears throughout Zen teaching. When you stop grasping so tightly, you often receive more than when you demanded specific results. When you allow life to flow naturally while offering your best contribution to that flow, solutions emerge that your controlling mind could never have planned. As your body continues to relax and your mind settles into quietness, rest in this understanding that you do not need to control everything to live well. You need only to respond wisely to what actually appears, moment by moment, breath by breath. In this response without force, this effort without strain, this caring without clinging, you will find a peace that no amount of control could ever provide. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice this gentle way of being. New chances to work with conditions as they arise, rather than demanding that they be different. New invitations to discover the beauty that emerges when your intentions meet reality with openness rather than resistance. Tonight, let your breath find its own perfect rhythm. Let your body settle into rest without effort. Let your mind release its need to manage and simply receive the natural peace that comes when control is gently set aside. This is the first step in learning to let go. This willingness to allow what wants to happen naturally, without force, without fight, without the exhausting attempt to make everything conform to how you think it should be. In a monastery high in the northern mountains, there lived a monk named Dogen who had found peace in the simple rhythm of prayer, meditation, and service. His days began before dawn with the sound of temple bells and continued through sunset with quiet work in the monastery gardens. To visitors, he appeared to embody the serenity that drew people to monastic life. But Dogen carried a weight that none of his fellow monks knew about. Before coming to the monastery 5 years earlier, he had been a soldier in the emperor's army. During those years, he had followed orders that resulted in actions he could barely think about without feeling sick with shame and regret. There had been a village suspected of harboring rebels. Dogen's unit had been ordered to search every house and arrest anyone who seemed suspicious. In the confusion and fear of that day, decisions had been made quickly, based on incomplete information and the heat of the moment. Innocent people had suffered because of actions Dogen had taken, orders he had followed without questioning deeply enough. When the war ended and soldiers were released from service, Dogen had wandered for months, unable to return to normal life. The faces of people he had harmed haunted his dreams. Their voices seemed to follow him during the day. He could not eat without thinking of families whose meals he had disrupted. He could not sleep peacefully knowing that his actions had cost others their peace. Eventually, this suffering had led him to the monastery, seeking refuge and perhaps forgiveness in a life dedicated to compassion and service. But even after 5 years of meditation, prayer, and good works, the weight of his past had not lifted. If anything, his growing understanding of Buddhist teachings about non-harm made his former actions feel even more terrible. Dogen spent hours in meditation trying to find peace with his past, but instead of serenity, he often found himself reliving those painful scenes over and over. He would imagine what he should have done differently, how he could have questioned orders more courageously, how he might have protected innocent people better. These mental rehearsals of alternative histories brought no relief, only deeper anguish about opportunities for compassion that he had missed. His fellow monks began to notice that despite his dedication to spiritual practice, Dogen seemed burdened rather than liberated by his life at the monastery. During group meditation, he would sit rigidly, his face tight with concentration and pain. During work periods, he labored with grim determination rather than peaceful mindfulness. Even during meals, he ate with the mechanical efficiency of someone fulfilling a duty rather than receiving nourishment. The abbot of the monastery, Master Ekai, was known for his wisdom in helping monks work through difficulties that arose during spiritual development. He had noticed Dogen's struggles, but had waited for the right moment to offer guidance, knowing that some burdens could only be addressed when a person was ready to receive help. One autumn morning, as Dogen knelt weeding the monastery garden with his usual tense concentration, Master Ekai approached and began working quietly beside him. They worked in silence for some time, pulling weeds and preparing the soil for winter rest. Finally, Master Ekai spoke. "Brother Dogen, I have watched you tend this garden for many seasons. You work very hard, but I have never seen you enjoy the feel of earth in your hands or notice the beauty of what grows here." Dogen looked up, startled by this observation. "I try to work mindfully, Master. I focus on each task completely." "Yes, you focus intensely. But your focus seems to be on something other than the present moment. Even when your hands are in the soil, your mind appears to be elsewhere." Dogen felt exposed by this gentle perception. "I struggle with distractions during practice." "What kind of distractions?" For a long moment, Dogen was silent. Then, slowly, he began to share the burden he had carried alone for so many years. He told Master Ekai about his time as a soldier, about the village, about the actions he had taken that seemed unforgivable. He spoke of the faces that haunted him, the regret that felt like a stone in his chest, the guilt that made every moment of peace feel stolen and undeserved. Master Ekai listened without judgment, his hands continuing to work gently with the soil. When Dogen finished speaking, they sat in silence as leaves fell around them in the golden morning light. "Thank you for sharing this pain with me," Master Ekai said finally. "I can see why this burden feels so heavy. Tell me, what do you believe carrying this guilt accomplishes?" "It honors the people who were harmed. It ensures I never forget the importance of compassion. It keeps me mindful of the consequences of my actions." "And has carrying this guilt changed what happened in that village?" "No," Dogen admitted. "Nothing can change what happened." "Has it brought healing to the people who were harmed?" "No. They don't even know I exist now." "Has it made you a more compassionate person?" Dogen considered this carefully. "I don't know. I thought it would, but mostly it makes me afraid to act at all. I second-guess every decision, worry that I might cause harm again." Master Ekai nodded slowly. "I see. So, this guilt that you carry to honor those who were harmed actually prevents you from acting compassionately in the present. The weight that you bear to ensure you never forget the importance of kindness makes it difficult for you to be kind to yourself or others right now." They continued weeding in silence while this observation settled. Then Master Ekai asked another question. "Who were you when those actions were taken?" "I was a soldier, following orders, trying to do my duty as I understood it then." "And who are you now?" "I am a monk, dedicated to non-harm and service." "Are you the same person?" Dogen felt something stir in his chest, a possibility he had never considered. "The person I am now would never take those actions. The understanding I have now makes choices I made then impossible." "Exactly. The man who sits here with me has been shaped by regret into someone who deeply values compassion. The actions you took as a soldier helped create the wisdom you now possess. Can you see that your past suffering and your present wisdom are connected?" Over the following weeks, Master Ekai continued to guide Dogen in examining his relationship with his past. They explored how regret could serve transformation without becoming a prison. How memory of past mistakes could inform present choices without paralyzing them. How acknowledging harm done could lead to dedication to preventing future harm without requiring eternal punishment. The past exists now only in your memory, Master Ekai explained during one of their conversations. You cannot change what happened, but you can change how you relate to what happened. You can carry the lessons without carrying the burden. This distinction gradually began to transform Dogen's experience of his past. Instead of replaying scenes of what went wrong with self-torture, he began to examine what those experiences had taught him about the importance of questioning authority, protecting the vulnerable, and thinking deeply about the consequences of actions. Instead of using his guilt as proof that he was irredeemably bad, he began to see his capacity for remorse as evidence of moral development. Instead of believing that peace was something he did not deserve, he began to understand that cultivating peace in himself was one way to honor those who had been deprived of peace by his past actions. One morning, several months after his conversation with Master Ekai, Dogen was again working in the monastery garden when he experienced something that would complete his transformation. As he knelt planting seeds for the spring garden, feeling the cool earth and smelling the rich scent of composted leaves, he suddenly found himself fully present in the moment for the first time in years. The weight he had carried for so long was still there, but it had transformed from a crushing burden into something more like rich soil. His past experiences, including the painful ones, had become the ground from which his current compassion could grow. He could feel genuine love for the earth in his hands, sincere care for the seeds he was planting, authentic peace in the simple act of nurturing new life. In that moment, Dogen understood that true forgiveness of himself did not mean forgetting what had happened or pretending it was not important. It meant allowing his past mistakes to serve his present dedication to kindness. The pain he had experienced because of actions he regretted had opened his heart to understanding the pain of others. The guilt that had once paralyzed him had motivated him to live differently. From that day forward, Dogen's practice transformed. His meditation became peaceful rather than tormented. His work in the garden became a source of joy rather than grim duty. His interactions with fellow monks and visitors became warm and natural rather than self-conscious and withdrawn. When visitors to the monastery noticed the change in him and asked about his serenity, Dogen would sometimes share what he had learned about carrying the past skillfully. Regret can be a teacher or a prison, he would say. When we use our mistakes to torment ourselves endlessly, we waste the lessons they offer. But when we allow our past pain to deepen our present compassion, our worst experiences can become sources of wisdom. In another part of the mountains, there lived a merchant named Fujiwara who had spent 30 years building what he considered a perfect life. Through careful planning, hard work, and strategic thinking, he had accumulated substantial wealth, earned respect in his community, and created a comfortable existence for his family. Fujiwara owned the largest trading business in his region, with warehouses full of goods, reliable relationships with suppliers and customers, and enough saved wealth to ensure security for generations. His house was filled with beautiful objects collected during years of successful trading. His children attended the best schools and expected to inherit both wealth and social position. More than his possessions, Fujiwara was proud of his identity as a successful businessman. He took satisfaction in being known as someone who could solve problems, negotiate fair deals, and provide good lives for his family and employees. When people in the community faced financial difficulties, they would often seek his advice or assistance. But one spring, heavy rains in the mountains caused floods that had not been seen for generations. The river that ran through Fujiwara's town, normally peaceful and contained, became a raging torrent that destroyed everything in its path. In a single day, Fujiwara lost everything. His warehouses were swept away with all their contents. His house was damaged beyond repair, and most of his beautiful possessions were destroyed or carried off by the floodwaters. The records of his business transactions, his accounts, his carefully built relationships with distant trading partners all disappeared in the chaos. Most devastating of all, the flood destroyed not just his wealth, but his entire identity. Without his business, his possessions, his role as a successful merchant, Fujiwara felt like he no longer knew who he was. The self-confidence that had carried him through decades of challenges evaporated when the external sources of that confidence were washed away. In the months following the flood, as the community began rebuilding, Fujiwara fell into deep despair. While his neighbors focused on reconstructing their simpler homes and livelihoods, he found himself paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had lost. Every time he tried to think about starting over, he was overwhelmed by memories of what his life had been before. He would walk through the town and see the empty foundation where his house had stood, remembering the beautiful room where he had entertained important guests. He would pass the cleared space where his warehouses had been, thinking about the carefully organized inventory that had represented years of accumulated success. He would encounter former business associates and feel ashamed that he could no longer offer them the deals and opportunities they had come to expect from him. Fujiwara's wife and children adapted to their reduced circumstances with resilience that surprised him. They found shelter with relatives, took on simple work to contribute to the household, and seemed to accept their changed situation with grace. But Fujiwara could not let go of what had been lost. He spent his days comparing their current poverty to their former prosperity, their present uncertainty to their past security. One evening, as Fujiwara sat by the river that had destroyed his life, an old monk named Brother Myoan approached and asked if he could share the peaceful spot by the water. Fujiwara agreed reluctantly, not feeling particularly interested in conversation, but too polite to refuse. They sat in silence for some time, watching the river flow gently now that the flood season had passed. Finally, Brother Myoan spoke. "This river has carved a new channel through your town. It flows differently than it did before the flood." "Yes," Fujiwara replied bitterly. "It destroyed everything in its path." "And now?" Fujiwara looked more carefully at the water. It was true that the river had carved a new course, but the water itself seemed calm and clear. Where the flooding had washed away debris and old structures, new green growth was already beginning to appear. "Now it flows peacefully," he admitted. The same water that brought destruction also brought renewal. The flood that ended one phase of life made space for whatever comes next, but I lost everything, Fujiwara said. 30 years of work gone in a single day. "Tell me," Brother Myoan asked gently, "what did you actually lose?" "My business, my wealth, my home, my position in the community." "And what do you still have?" This question annoyed Fujiwara. "Nothing of importance. Just the clothes I'm wearing and whatever charity people offer." "What about your skills as a trader? Your understanding of business?" Your knowledge of what people need and value? Fujiwara had not thought about these things as possessions he still owned. I suppose those are still there. And your relationships with your family? Your years of experience in solving problems? Your ability to work hard and think strategically? Slowly, Fujiwara began to realize that while he had lost the external results of 30 years of work, he had not lost the capabilities that had created those results. The flood had taken away what he had built, but it could not wash away what he had learned. But even if I still have these abilities, Fujiwara said, I'm too old to start over. I don't have the energy to rebuild what took decades to create. Who says you need to rebuild the same thing? Brother Myoan asked. Perhaps what you lost was meant to be let go, so something new could emerge. Over the following weeks, this conversation remained in Fujiwara's mind. Gradually, he began to notice that his attachment to his former life was preventing him from seeing possibilities in his present situation. While he was focused on mourning what was gone, opportunities for new kinds of contribution were appearing around him. The flood had created needs in the community that hadn't existed before. People needed help organizing rebuilding efforts. They needed someone who understood logistics and planning. They needed a person with experience in negotiating and problem solving to help coordinate recovery work. Slowly, almost without making a conscious decision, Fujiwara began to offer his skills to these community needs. Instead of trading for profit, he found himself trading his knowledge and experience for the satisfaction of helping his neighbors rebuild their lives. At first, this felt like a poor substitute for his former success. But as weeks passed, Fujiwara discovered something unexpected. Working to help others recover from the disaster brought him a sense of purpose and satisfaction that his personal wealth accumulation had never provided. One morning, as he was helping organize the rebuilding of the community market, Fujiwara realized that he was genuinely happy for the first time since the flood. Not happy in the way he had been when business was prosperous, but happy in a deeper, more peaceful way that did not depend on external circumstances. The work he was doing now used the same skills he had developed as a merchant, but directed toward community benefit rather than personal gain. The recognition he received from neighbors was based on his helpfulness rather than his wealth. The security he felt came from knowing he could contribute meaningfully regardless of what he owned. In that moment of realization, Fujiwara experienced a profound letting go. He released his attachment to the identity of successful merchant and discovered underneath it a more essential identity of useful person. He let go of defining himself by what he possessed and found a definition based on what he could offer. The flood had forced him to lose everything external, but in losing those things he had found something internal that could never be washed away by any disaster. His capacity to contribute, to solve problems, to care about others' well-being, these were possessions that no flood could destroy. Years later, when young merchants would ask Fujiwara for advice about building wealth and security, he would tell them about the flood that had been both the worst and best thing that ever happened to him. I thought security came from accumulating things that could be lost, he would explain. But real security comes from developing capabilities that can never be taken away. I thought identity came from what I owned, but I discovered it comes from what I can offer. The flood took away everything I thought I needed and revealed everything I actually need. These two stories teach us profound truths about releasing our attachment to the past, whether that past contains actions we regret or achievements we have lost. Dogen's transformation shows us that we can carry the lessons of past mistakes without being imprisoned by guilt and shame. His journey from tormented regret to peaceful wisdom demonstrates that our worst experiences can become sources of compassion if we learn to relate to them skillfully. The key insight in Dogen's story is that endless self-punishment does not honor those we may have harmed or prevent future harm from occurring. In fact, being paralyzed by guilt often prevents us from acting compassionately in the present. True amends for past mistakes come through allowing those mistakes to teach us how to live more wisely now. Zen Buddhism teaches that the past exists only in memory, not in reality. The actions you took yesterday, the words you spoke last week, the choices you made years ago, all exist now only as thoughts arising in present awareness. You cannot change what happened, but you can change how you relate to what happened. This does not mean pretending that past actions were unimportant or denying the real effects they may have had. It means distinguishing between honoring the lessons of experience and torturing yourself with endless regret. The person you are now has been shaped by all your experiences, including the painful ones. Your capacity for wisdom often grows directly from your capacity for learning from mistakes. Fujiwara's story illustrates another aspect of letting go of the past, releasing attachment to former identities and achievements. Like many people, Fujiwara had built his sense of self around external accomplishments and possessions. When these were taken away, he initially felt like he no longer existed. But the flood revealed what the Buddhist teachings call the difference between the small self and the true self. The small self consists of roles, possessions, achievements, and social positions. The true self includes the deeper capabilities, wisdom, and capacity for love that exist independent of external circumstances. When Fujiwara learned to let go of defining himself by what he had accumulated and discovered his identity in what he could contribute, he found a sense of security and satisfaction that no external loss could threaten. This is the freedom that comes from loosening our attachment to past achievements and identities. Many people live as prisoners of their own past success, feeling obligated to maintain identities and lifestyles that no longer serve them. Others remain trapped by past failures, believing that mistakes define their worth permanently. Both forms of attachment to the past prevent us from responding freely to present opportunities. The wisdom in both stories is that the past can inform the present without controlling it. Dogen learned to let his past mistakes inform his present commitment to compassion without allowing guilt to paralyze his ability to act compassionately. Fujiwara learned to let his past success inform his present service without being trapped by the need to recreate former achievements. In your own life, notice where attachment to the past may be limiting your freedom in the present. Are there regrets you carry that have become more burdensome than instructive? Are there past achievements you cling to that prevent you from growing in new directions? Are there former identities you maintain that no longer serve your actual development? Letting go of the past does not mean losing the valuable lessons it has taught you. It means carrying those lessons lightly, as wisdom rather than burden. It means allowing what you have learned from experience to guide present choices without demanding that the present recreate or fix the past. As your breathing naturally deepens and your body settles into rest, notice how each exhale naturally releases what is no longer needed. Your lungs do not hold on to yesterday's breath. They let it go completely to make space for fresh air to enter. This same natural rhythm of release and renewal can guide your relationship with past experiences. What no longer serves you can be exhaled gently. What nourishes your present wisdom can be retained without grasping. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to respond to life from what you have learned rather than from what you regret or miss. The past has brought you to this present moment. It has taught you valuable lessons about compassion, resilience, and what truly matters. Honor those lessons by allowing them to guide you toward greater freedom and peace. Let go of what cannot be changed. Embrace what can still unfold. Rest in the understanding that who you are now includes all you have experienced without being limited by any of it. Tomorrow offers new chances to apply the wisdom your past has taught you. New opportunities to choose compassion over regret, service over self-pity, presence over nostalgia. Tonight, let the past rest in memory where it belongs, while your heart remains open to whatever wants to emerge in the continuing flow of life. In a prosperous market town, there lived a tea merchant named Noboru who had built what appeared to be a successful business over many years. His shop occupied a prime location on the main street, and his customers included some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the community. Noboru took great pride in being known as someone who understood quality and could provide exactly what discriminating customers desired. But Noboru's success came at a hidden cost that was consuming his peace and authenticity. Over the years, he had gradually shaped his entire business around what he believed would impress his customers, rather than what he genuinely thought would serve them best. He stocked teas that were fashionable rather than teas he personally found most satisfying. He decorated his shop according to current trends rather than his own aesthetic preferences. He even trained himself to speak and behave in ways that he thought would create the right impression with important customers. This constant adaptation to others' expectations had become so habitual that Noboru had almost forgotten what his own preferences actually were. When he tasted different teas, his first thought was not whether he enjoyed them, but whether they would appeal to customers who expected him to stock only the finest varieties. When he arranged his shop displays, he chose items not for their beauty or functionality, but for their ability to signal sophistication and good taste to visitors. The exhausting effort of maintaining this carefully constructed image began to affect every aspect of Noboru's life. He found himself changing his opinions about various topics depending on which customers he was speaking with. He would praise certain tea ceremonies when talking to traditional customers, then criticize those same ceremonies when speaking with people who preferred modern approaches. He would express enthusiasm for expensive imports when serving wealthy clients, then complain about the excessive cost of foreign goods when talking to more modest customers. This constant shifting of positions to match what he thought others wanted to hear made conversations feel performative rather than genuine. Noboru began to feel like he was acting a role rather than expressing himself honestly. Worse, he started to doubt his own judgment about tea, about business, and about what truly mattered to him personally. The strain of this performance became particularly evident during a busy festival season when many visitors came to town and his shop was constantly full of potential customers. Noboru found himself agreeing with contradictory opinions expressed by different people within the same hour. When one customer praised a particular type of tea ceremony as the height of refinement, Noboru enthusiastically agreed. When the next customer criticized that same ceremony as pretentious and outdated, Noboru nodded along with equal enthusiasm. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day of shifting his expressed opinions to match various customers' preferences, Noboru realized he could no longer remember what he actually thought about topics he had once felt passionate about. His genuine preferences had been buried under layers of calculated responses designed to please others. That evening, feeling confused and depleted, Noboru closed his shop early and walked to a small temple on the outskirts of town, where he sometimes went to find quiet when business pressures became overwhelming. As he sat in the peaceful garden, trying to sort through his tangled thoughts, an elderly monk named Brother Rio approached and asked if he could share the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for some time, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Finally, Brother Rio spoke quietly. "You seem troubled, friend. Is there something weighing on your mind?" Noboru found himself sharing his confusion about his business, his customers, and his own lost sense of authentic preference. He described how trying to please everyone had left him uncertain about his own opinions on topics he had once understood clearly. "I used to love tea," Noboru said. "I used to have strong feelings about which varieties were truly exceptional and which ceremonies brought out the best qualities in different blends. But now I find myself praising whatever I think each customer wants to hear. I've lost touch with my own taste." Brother Rio listened thoughtfully. When Noboru finished speaking, the monk asked a simple question that cut to the heart of the matter. "When you started your tea business, what drew you to this work?" Noboru had to think back many years to remember. "I loved sharing good tea with people. I enjoyed helping them discover flavors and ceremonies that brought them pleasure and peace. I felt excited about connecting people with teas that matched their genuine preferences." "And do you still help people discover what truly brings them pleasure?" This question made Noboru pause. He realized that in his effort to impress customers with his sophisticated knowledge, he had stopped asking them what they actually enjoyed. Instead of helping them explore their own tastes, he had been trying to convince them to appreciate whatever he thought would make him seem knowledgeable and successful. "I think I've been more focused on demonstrating my expertise than on serving their real needs," Noboru admitted. "And how has this approach affected your satisfaction with your work?" "It's made everything feel false and exhausting. Even when customers praise my knowledge or buy expensive teas, I don't feel genuinely satisfied because I know I'm performing rather than sharing something I truly believe in." Brother Rio was quiet for a moment, watching leaves fall in the temple garden. Then he asked another penetrating question. "If you were the only person who would ever know about the quality of tea you served, how would you run your business?" This hypothetical struck Noboru powerfully. If no one else would ever form an opinion about his choices, if there were no customers to impress and no reputation to maintain, what kind of tea would he stock? How would he arrange his shop? What kind of service would he offer? As he considered these questions, Noboru began to reconnect with preferences and values he had not consulted in years. He realized that if he were serving tea only for his own satisfaction, he would choose varieties based on their actual quality and character rather than their fashionable reputation. He would create a shop environment that felt welcoming and authentic rather than impressive. He would focus on understanding each customer's genuine preferences rather than trying to shape their opinions to match current trends. Over the following weeks, Noboru gradually began to restructure his business around his rediscovered authentic preferences rather than his assumptions about what would impress others. This process required courage, as it meant risking the disapproval of customers who had become accustomed to his agreeable adaptability. He started offering tea varieties that he personally found exceptional, even when they were less fashionable than what other merchants were promoting. He rearranged his shop to reflect his own aesthetic sensibilities rather than current decorating trends. Most importantly, he began asking customers about their own taste preferences and guiding them toward teas that matched what they actually enjoyed rather than what he thought they should appreciate. The results of this transformation surprised Noboru. Rather than losing customers because he was no longer trying to please everyone, he began attracting people who appreciated his authentic expertise and genuine recommendations. His conversations with customers became more satisfying because they were based on honest exchange rather than calculated performance. One morning, several months after his conversation with Brother Rio, a long-time customer made an observation that confirmed Noboru's transformation. "Your recommendations have become much more helpful lately," the customer said. "You seem to really understand what I enjoy, and the teas you suggest always suit my taste perfectly." Noboru realized that by focusing on serving customers' genuine needs rather than managing their opinions of him, he had become more effective at his actual work. When he stopped performing expertise and started sharing authentic knowledge, people trusted his guidance more completely. The deeper change was in Noboru's own relationship with his work. Tea tasting became enjoyable again because he was evaluating flavors according to his genuine palate rather than trying to figure out the correct opinion to express. Business decisions became clearer because they were based on his authentic values rather than calculations about what would create the best impression. Years later, when Noboru had become known throughout the region for his honest expertise and exceptional tea selection, he would reflect on the transformation that began with Brother Rio's simple questions. "I learned that trying to please everyone actually serves no one well," he would tell younger merchants who sought his advice. "When you lose touch with your own authentic judgment, you have nothing genuine to offer others. But when you serve from your true understanding and sincere care, people sense that authenticity and trust your guidance." Noboru's story reveals something profound about how the need for others' approval can undermine the very qualities it seeks to demonstrate. The tea merchant discovered that trying to manage others' opinions actually prevented him from developing authentic expertise and genuine service. The tea merchant's transformation shows how being controlled by customers' opinions had disconnected him from the authentic knowledge and passion that made him genuinely valuable as a guide to quality tea. When he stopped performing expertise and started sharing real understanding, his service improved and his satisfaction with work returned. Noboru's story points to an essential insight. Authentic development in any area requires the freedom to be honestly where you are, rather than pretending to be where you think others expect you to be. Zen Buddhism recognizes that the need for approval often comes from a misunderstanding about the source of true confidence and security. When we believe our worth depends on others' opinions, we become trapped in an impossible situation. We cannot control what others think, but we exhaust ourselves trying to manage their perceptions. This creates several problems. First, it prevents authentic self-knowledge because we are so focused on how we appear externally that we lose touch with our actual inner experience. Second, it makes us less effective at our actual work because energy goes into image management rather than genuine skill development. Third, it creates anxiety and self-consciousness that interferes with natural performance and expression. The alternative that Noboru discovered involves shifting the source of validation from external approval to internal alignment. Instead of asking, "What will others think of this choice?" he learned to ask, "What choice reflects my genuine understanding and values?" This does not mean becoming indifferent to others or dismissing all feedback. Noboru continued to care about serving his community well, but he distinguished between caring about others' well-being and being controlled by others' opinions. Useful feedback from others can help us see blind spots in our thinking or areas where our skills need development. But this feedback is most helpful when we can receive it without our sense of worth depending on whether the feedback is positive or negative. When your confidence comes from knowing yourself clearly rather than from others thinking well of you, criticism becomes information rather than threat. You can consider whether feedback points to something useful to learn without feeling defensive or devastated when others don't approve of your choices. Similarly, praise becomes appreciated but not necessary. You can enjoy others' recognition without depending on it for your sense of value or competence. The practice of letting go of others' opinions involves learning to distinguish between your actual preferences and what you think others want you to prefer. Like Noboru discovering his genuine taste in tea, you can reconnect with your authentic values and interests by asking what you would choose if no one else would ever know about your decision. This requires courage because it means risking disapproval from people who have become accustomed to your agreeable adaptability. But it also brings tremendous relief because you no longer need to carry the impossible burden of trying to please everyone while remaining true to yourself. In any area of development, authenticity is essential for genuine progress. Spiritual growth requires the willingness to work with your actual experience rather than trying to create experiences that would look good to others. The deepest freedom comes from understanding that you cannot control others' opinions and do not need to control them. People will think what they think based on their own conditioning, preferences, and limited information about your situation. Their opinions reflect their perspective more than your actual worth or competence. When you stop trying to manage others' perceptions and start focusing on developing your authentic capabilities and living according to your genuine values, something remarkable happens. People often respond more positively to authenticity than they ever did to your efforts to please them. This happens because authenticity is attractive and trustworthy in ways that performance cannot match. When others sense that you are being genuine rather than calculating, they feel more comfortable being genuine themselves. When they see that you have clear values and preferences, they trust your judgment more than when you seem to shift positions based on what you think they want to hear. As your breathing naturally deepens and your body settles into rest, notice how the breath flows without concern for others' opinions about how you should breathe. Your lungs do not worry about impressing anyone with their technique. Your heart does not try to beat in a way that would earn approval. The natural functions of your body operate from their own intelligence rather than from concern about external evaluation. This same natural authenticity is available in all areas of life. You can speak from your genuine understanding rather than from calculations about what would sound impressive. You can make choices based on your actual values rather than on what you think others expect. You can develop your capabilities according to your real interests rather than according to what would create the best impression. The peace that comes from this authenticity is deeper and more stable than any satisfaction that comes from others' approval. External approval feels good temporarily, but requires constant maintenance and can be withdrawn at any time. Internal alignment with your genuine values and authentic development creates a sense of rightness that persists regardless of others' changing opinions. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice this freedom from others' opinions. New chances to choose authenticity over performance, genuine development over impressive appearance, internal validation over external approval. Tonight, rest in the understanding that your worth is not determined by what others think about you. Your value comes from your capacity for awareness, growth, compassion, and authentic contribution to life. These qualities develop through honest engagement with your experience not through managing your image. Let go of the exhausting effort to control others' perceptions. Trust that being genuinely yourself serves both your own development and your ability to contribute meaningfully to others' lives. In this trust, in this authenticity, in this freedom from the prison of seeking approval, you will find a peace that no opinion can disturb and a confidence that no criticism can destroy. In a valley known for its fertile soil, there lived a farmer named Ichiro who had inherited his land from his father and grandfather before him. For 15 years, he had worked the same fields, growing rice that fed his family and provided surplus to sell in the nearby market town. His neighbors considered him knowledgeable and successful, often seeking his advice about timing and techniques for their own crops. But beneath Ichiro's competent exterior, anxiety churned like a restless wind. From the moment he planted each season's rice until the final grain was harvested and stored, he worried constantly about everything that could go wrong. Too much rain might flood the young plants. Too little rain might stunt their growth. Insects might arrive in swarms to devour the green shoots. Disease might spread through the fields. Early frost might kill the crop before it could mature. Each morning, Ichiro would wake before dawn not from peaceful readiness to work, but from dreams filled with images of failed harvests and empty granaries. He would walk through his fields, checking for signs of trouble, examining each plant with anxious attention, searching for evidence of problems that might be beginning to develop. His worry extended far beyond the current growing season. Even when this year's crop was thriving, Ichiro would begin fretting about next year's planting. What if the weather patterns changed? What if pests developed resistance to his protective measures? What if market prices fell and his usual income could not support his family? What if his aging body could no longer handle the demanding physical work of farming? These concerns multiplied endlessly in his mind. If next year's harvest failed, how would he feed his children? If his income dropped, how could he maintain his house and equipment? If he became too old to farm, who would care for the land his family had tended for generations? Each worry spawned additional worries, creating an ever-expanding web of anxiety about possibilities that existed only in his imagination. Ichiro's preoccupation with future troubles began to interfere with his present effectiveness. While walking through his fields, instead of noticing what his crops actually needed today, he was mentally rehearsing responses to problems that might arise next month. While working, instead of being fully present with the task at hand, he was calculating and recalculating how various imagined disasters might affect his family's security. His wife and children noticed that even during good times, when crops were healthy and prospects looked favorable, Ichiro seemed unable to enjoy their abundance. At dinner, when they expressed gratitude for the day's work and the food on their table, he would remind them that next season's success was not guaranteed. When neighbors complimented his thriving fields, he would immediately mention all the threats that could still destroy the harvest. The constant anxiety was exhausting for Ichiro and difficult for his family to witness. His children began to feel that their father saw farming as a series of potential disasters rather than a way of participating in the natural cycles of growth and harvest. His wife worried that his fear of future problems was preventing him from appreciating present blessings. One autumn, an elderly monk named Brother Kosho visited the valley during the harvest season. He was traveling between monasteries and asked if he could help with farm work in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. Ichiro agreed, partly from generosity and partly because extra hands were always welcome during the busy harvest time. Brother Kosho worked alongside Ichiro for several days, moving quietly through the fields with steady, unhurried attention. He seemed to notice everything about the immediate work: the weight of the rice stalks, the texture of the soil, the quality of the grain they were gathering. But he showed no anxiety about the work, no rushed urgency to finish quickly. On the third day, as they paused to rest in the shade during the hottest part of the afternoon, Brother Kosho made an observation that surprised Ichiro. "You have produced a magnificent harvest this year. The grain is healthy and abundant. Yet you work as if disaster were imminent." Ichiro felt defensive. A farmer must always be alert to problems. There are so many things that can go wrong. Indeed there are. Tell me, what specific problem are you watching for right now? Ichiro looked around the field where they were working. The harvest was proceeding smoothly. The weather was perfect for gathering grain. No pests were visible. No disease was evident. The immediate present moment contained no actual problems. "Well, not right now specifically," Ichiro admitted. "But next year's planting season could bring many difficulties." "And when next year's planting season arrives, will you be present to address whatever challenges it brings?" "Of course." "So you are spending today's energy worrying about problems you will handle tomorrow if they occur?" This question stopped Ichiro short. He had never thought about it quite this way. "I suppose so, yes." Brother Kosho was quiet for a moment, watching a bird land on a nearby fence post and then fly away. "I noticed that bird does not seem worried about where tomorrow's food will come from. Yet it appears well-fed and healthy. But birds are different from humans. They don't have to plan ahead or take responsibility for their families." "True. But tell me, does your worry about next year's challenges help you prepare for them more effectively?" Ichiro considered this carefully. Most of his anxiety was not about practical preparation. He did plan ahead, researching better farming techniques, saving seeds from his best plants, maintaining his tools and equipment. But the worry that kept him awake at night and distracted him during the day was not productive planning. It was simply mental rehearsal of feared scenarios over which he had little control. "I suppose most of my worry doesn't actually help me prepare," he admitted reluctantly. "It just makes me feel like I'm doing something about uncertainties." "And how do you feel when you spend your energy this way?" "Tired. Anxious. Sometimes I can barely enjoy good times because I'm so focused on how they might end." Brother Kosho nodded understanding. "Would you like to learn a different way to think about the future?" Over the remaining days of harvest, Brother Kosho shared with Ichiro a perspective on time and planning that gradually began to transform the farmer's relationship with uncertainty. "The future exists only in imagination," the monk explained as they worked together. "When tomorrow arrives, it will be today. Next year, when it comes, will be this year. You will always meet challenges in the present moment, never in some imagined future time." This insight began to shift something in Ichiro's thinking. He realized that he had been living as if the future were a separate realm where problems would be more difficult to handle than they were in present reality. But actually, he would face future challenges with the same capabilities, the same immediate attention, the same ability to respond skillfully that he possessed right now. "Prudent planning serves the future," Brother Kosho continued. "But anxious worrying serves nothing. Planning means taking wise action today to prepare for likely possibilities. Worrying means suffering today about possibilities that may never occur. Ichiro began to understand the difference. Saving high-quality seeds for next year's planting was planning. Lying awake imagining crop failures was worrying. Learning new farming techniques was planning. Rehearsing mental scenarios of financial ruin was worrying. Maintaining tools and equipment was planning. Constantly calculating how various disasters might unfold was worrying. The monk taught Ichiro a simple practice for distinguishing between helpful preparation and useless anxiety. When you notice your mind turning toward future concerns, Brother Kosho suggested, ask yourself 2 questions. First, is there some specific action I can take today to address this concern? Is this concern about something likely to happen or just something possible to imagine? If there was useful action to take today, Ichiro learned to take it and then release the worry. If the concern was about remote possibilities rather than likely problems, he practiced gently redirecting his attention to present tasks and immediate reality. This practice did not eliminate Ichiro's natural prudence and responsibility as a farmer. He continued to plan carefully, prepare for seasonal changes, and learn better methods for growing crops. But the constant underlying anxiety about everything that could go wrong began to fade. One morning, several weeks after Brother Kosho had continued his journey, Ichiro woke before dawn as usual and walked out to check his fields. But instead of anxiously searching for signs of potential problems, he found himself simply appreciating the beauty of the early morning light on the empty fields where next year's crops would grow. He realized that he felt peaceful in a way he had not experienced for years. Not because the uncertainties of farming had disappeared, but because he had learned to carry those uncertainties lightly. He could acknowledge that next year might bring challenges while trusting his ability to meet those challenges when they actually arrived. The future would always contain unknowns. Weather would remain unpredictable. Market conditions would fluctuate. Equipment would occasionally fail. But Ichiro understood now that he could prepare wisely for likely possibilities without suffering unnecessarily about imaginary disasters. His family immediately noticed the change in him. At meals, he could enjoy their food without immediately mentioning future concerns. When neighbors complimented his farming success, he could accept their praise with genuine gratitude. When his children asked about their future security, he could offer realistic reassurance based on his actual capabilities rather than sharing his anxieties about everything that might go wrong. Years later, when younger farmers sought Ichiro's advice about managing the uncertainties of agricultural life, he would tell them about the monk who taught him the difference between planning and worrying. "Prepare for what you can reasonably expect," he would say. "But don't waste your present peace suffering about possibilities that exist only in fearful imagination. The future will arrive one day at a time, and you will meet each day with the same wisdom and capability you possess right now." In a mountain village renowned for its artisans, there lived a calligrapher named Sato who had dedicated his life to mastering the ancient art of brush painting. For 20 years, he had studied under respected teachers, practiced daily for hours, and developed technical skills that were admired throughout the region. His characters were precisely formed, his brushwork was controlled and elegant, and his compositions followed traditional principles with meticulous accuracy. But despite his obvious competence, Sato felt trapped by his own pursuit of flawless execution. Each piece he created had to meet impossibly high standards before he would consider it acceptable. He would spend entire days working on a single character, adjusting the pressure of his brush, the angle of each stroke, the spacing between elements, until every detail matched his internal vision of perfect form. Most of his work ended up destroyed. If a brushstroke was even slightly uneven, if the ink flow was not perfectly consistent, if the proportions deviated from classical ideals by the smallest measure, Sato would crumple the paper and begin again. His studio was filled with discarded attempts, partial works abandoned when they failed to achieve the flawless execution he demanded. The constant starting over had begun to drain the joy from his practice. What had once been a source of meditation and creative expression had become a source of frustration and self-criticism. Sato found himself approaching each blank paper with anxiety rather than excitement, knowing that the chances of achieving his perfect vision were slim and that disappointment was likely. His friends and fellow artisans would occasionally see pieces he considered failures and express admiration for their beauty and life. But Sato could see only the flaws that prevented each work from meeting his exacting standards. A character that others found graceful and expressive would appear to him as evidence of inadequate control and insufficient skill. This perfectionism was affecting not only his art, but his entire approach to life. Sato applied the same impossible standards to his daily activities. His house had to be arranged with perfect order. His meals had to be prepared exactly according to traditional methods. His interactions with others had to follow proper social forms without the slightest deviation. The exhausting effort of maintaining these standards left little energy for spontaneity, creativity, or simple enjoyment. Sato lived in constant tension between his actual experience and his ideal of how things should be. One autumn day, Master Takuan, an elderly monk known for his own exceptional calligraphy, visited the village and asked to see examples of local artistic work. Sato was honored to be invited to share his pieces but felt anxious about showing work that he considered imperfect to such a respected master. He selected his 3 most technically accomplished pieces, works that came closest to meeting his standards for precise execution and classical correctness. When he presented them to Master Takuan, the old monk examined them carefully, appreciating their technical skill and adherence to traditional forms. "These show great control and knowledge of proper technique," Master Takuan observed. "You have clearly studied the classical methods thoroughly." Sato felt pleased by this recognition, but sensed something reserved in the master's response. "Is there something lacking in these works, Master?" Master Takuan was quiet for a moment, studying the calligraphy again. "They are very correct. Perhaps too correct. Tell me, where is the artist in these characters?" This question confused Sato. "I try to follow the traditional forms exactly as they should be written." "Yes, I can see that. But where is your own spirit? Where is the aliveness that comes from this particular moment, this particular brushstroke, this particular breath?" Sato did not understand what the master meant. He had always believed that following traditional forms precisely was the highest achievement in calligraphy. "May I see your practice papers?" Master Takuan asked. "The pieces you work on when you are not trying to create finished art." Reluctantly, Sato brought out some of the casual brushwork he did during daily practice, characters written quickly without the intense concentration he brought to formal pieces. These were works he had never considered showing to anyone because they contained obvious imperfections and deviations from classical standards. Master Takuan examined these practice pieces with immediate interest. His face lit up as he studied characters that Sato considered sloppy and inadequate. "Here," the master said, pointing to a character written with flowing, uneven strokes. "This has life. This has breath. This character was not trying to be perfect. It was simply being itself. Sato looked at the character Master Takuan was admiring and saw only flaws. The brushwork was irregular. The proportions were unbalanced. The ink flow showed variations in pressure and speed. But Master, that character violates several principles of proper form. Does it? Or does it express something that rigid adherence to principles cannot capture? Master Takuan picked up a brush and demonstrated, writing the same character with loose, confident strokes that captured the essence of the meaning while deviating significantly from textbook form. Classical principles are like the banks of a river, the master explained. They give the water direction and structure, but the water itself must flow naturally within those banks. If you make the banks so narrow and rigid that the water cannot flow at all, you have defeated the purpose of both the banks and the water. Over the following days, Master Takuan worked with Sato to explore a different approach to calligraphy. Instead of trying to write perfect characters, the master encouraged him to write alive characters. Instead of controlling every detail of execution, he guided Sato toward allowing natural expression to emerge within the framework of traditional knowledge. "Let the brush dance," Master Takuan suggested during one of their sessions. "You know the forms well enough that you do not need to think about them consciously. Trust your hand to follow the principles while your spirit guides the expression." This approach felt terrifying to Sato at first. Without conscious control over every detail, how could he ensure that his work would be acceptable? But gradually, as he learned to relax his grip on perfect execution, something unexpected began to emerge in his calligraphy. Characters written with this looser approach had a quality of spontaneity and life that his carefully controlled work had lacked. The slight variations in brushwork that he had always considered flaws began to look like expressions of natural rhythm and breath. The imperfections that had once frustrated him started to feel like marks of authenticity and humanity. One morning, several weeks after Master Takuan had continued his journey, Sato was practicing with this new approach when something shifted fundamentally in his understanding. As he wrote a character with relaxed attention, allowing the brush to follow its natural movement within the structure of proper form, he suddenly saw that the slight asymmetry and irregular ink flow were not deviations from beauty, but expressions of it. The character was imperfect according to rigid technical standards, but it was alive in a way that his perfectly controlled work had never been. It captured not just the meaning of the word, but the particular moment of its creation, the specific quality of attention he had brought to the brushwork, the unique conditions of that morning's practice. From that moment, Sato's relationship with his art transformed completely. He continued to value technical skill and knowledge of traditional forms, but he held these elements lightly as tools for expression rather than as rigid rules for perfection. His work began to show a quality of vitality and presence that attracted attention from collectors and fellow artists throughout the region. More importantly, the practice of calligraphy became a source of joy and meditation again, rather than a source of anxiety and self-criticism. Each session with brush and ink became an opportunity to explore the dance between structure and spontaneity, between knowledge and intuition, between intention and surrender. Years later, when students would ask Sato about developing skill in calligraphy, he would tell them about Master Takuan's teaching on the difference between perfect technique and alive expression. Learn the forms thoroughly, he would advise. Practice until the principles become second nature. But then trust those principles to guide you while you allow your natural expression to flow. The most beautiful calligraphy includes imperfections that no perfect technique could achieve. In another part of the mountains, there lived a temple groundskeeper named Jiro, who took great pride in maintaining the monastery gardens in perfect condition. Every morning before dawn, he would walk through the courtyards and pathways, removing any fallen leaves, sweeping every stone surface, ensuring that every plant was properly pruned and every element was in its designated place. The gardens under Jiro's care were admired by all who visited the monastery. Not a single weed could be found growing between the carefully arranged stones. No leaf was allowed to remain on the ground for more than a few hours after falling. Every shrub was trimmed precise dimensions, every flower bed maintained in geometric perfection. But Jiro's pursuit of garden perfection had become an exhausting obsession that consumed nearly all his waking hours. He would spend entire days adjusting the position of individual stones to achieve better visual balance. He would prune plants so frequently that many never had the chance to grow into their natural forms. He would rake the gravel paths multiple times each day to ensure that no footprint or wind disturbance remained visible. The constant vigilance required to maintain this level of perfection left Jiro little time for rest or reflection. Even during meditation periods, his mind would wander to concerns about whether wind might be disturbing his carefully arranged leaves or whether new growth might be disrupting the precise lines of his plantings. Fellow monks began to notice that Jiro seemed more anxious than peaceful despite working in what should have been an environment conducive to serenity. His relationship with the gardens had become one of constant struggle against natural processes rather than harmonious participation in them. The monastery's abbot, Master Aisai, was known for his deep understanding of how external environment could support or hinder inner development. He had observed Jiro's increasingly frantic efforts to control every detail of the gardens and recognized that this approach was creating suffering rather than supporting the contemplative atmosphere the gardens were meant to provide. One morning, as Jiro was meticulously removing individual fallen leaves from beneath a maple tree, Master Aisai approached and asked if they could work together for a while. "Brother Jiro, your dedication to these gardens is evident in their beauty. But I notice you seem troubled rather than peaceful in your work. What is your experience while tending these spaces?" Jiro felt embarrassed to admit his struggle to someone who embodied such serenity. "I want the gardens to be perfect, Master, worthy of the sacred space they surround. But there is always something that needs correction. Leaves fall, plants grow beyond their intended boundaries, weather disturbs careful arrangements. I cannot keep up with all the imperfections that constantly appear. And how do you feel when you see these natural changes occurring?" "Frustrated. Sometimes I am almost angry. I work so hard to create perfect order, and nature seems determined to undo my efforts immediately." Master Aisai was quiet for a moment, observing the immaculate garden around them. Then he asked an unexpected question. "What season is it now, Brother Jiro?" "Autumn, Master." "And what does autumn naturally bring?" "Falling leaves, the death of annual plants, the preparation for winter rest." "And in your perfect garden, are you allowing autumn to be autumn?" This question stopped Jiro completely. He realized that in his effort to maintain perpetual perfection, he had been fighting against the natural seasons. He was removing autumn leaves as if they were mistakes rather than recognizing them as autumn's gift. He was preventing plants from following their natural cycles of growth and dormancy. He was trying to impose a static perfection on systems designed to flow through constant change. "I think I have been trying to make the garden exist outside of time and season," Jiro admitted slowly. "And how has this worked for you?" "It hasn't. I am exhausted from fighting natural processes, and the garden feels lifeless despite being perfectly arranged." Master Eisai suggested an experiment. "For the next month, I want you to tend the gardens differently. Instead of trying to prevent change, help natural changes happen beautifully. Instead of removing every fallen leaf, arrange them in ways that enhance the garden's seasonal character. Instead of fighting against natural growth patterns, guide them in directions that serve both the plant's health and the garden's harmony." This approach felt dangerous to Jiro at first. Allowing imperfection seemed like abandoning his responsibility to maintain proper standards. But as he began to experiment with working with natural processes rather than against them, something unexpected happened. The gardens began to feel alive in ways they never had when maintained in rigid perfection. Fallen leaves arranged naturally around the base of trees created beautiful color patterns that changed daily as more leaves fell. Plants allowed to grow according to their nature, while being gently guided, developed more interesting and graceful forms than those shaped strictly according to geometric plans. Most surprisingly, this approach required less effort than his previous attempts to control every detail. When he worked with natural tendencies rather than fighting them, maintenance became a flowing response to what each day brought, rather than a constant battle against change. One morning, as Jiro was allowing autumn leaves to settle naturally while arranging them to enhance rather than hide the garden's stone pathways, he experienced a moment of profound recognition. The slight asymmetry created by natural leaf fall was more beautiful than the perfect symmetry he had been trying to maintain. The irregular patterns formed by wind and gravity contained a quality of spontaneous grace that no human planning could achieve. In that moment, Jiro understood what Master Eisai had been trying to teach him. True beauty included imperfection as an essential element, not as something to be eliminated. The gardens were most beautiful when they expressed the natural processes of growth, decay, and renewal rather than when they denied those processes in favor of static perfection. From that day forward, Jiro's approach to garden maintenance transformed completely. He continued to tend the spaces with care and attention, but now his work felt like a collaboration with natural forces rather than a war against them. The gardens developed a quality of seasonal beauty that visitors found more moving and inspiring than the previous rigid perfection. His own experience of the work became peaceful and meditative rather than anxious and controlling. Each day brought new opportunities to notice how natural changes could be guided and enhanced rather than problems to be solved and imperfections to be eliminated. Years later, when other groundskeepers would visit to learn from Jiro's approach to garden maintenance, he would share Master Eisai's teaching about the difference between perfect control and perfect harmony. "A garden is not a picture to be kept unchanged," he would explain. "It is a living system that expresses different kinds of beauty through every season. Your role is not to prevent change, but to help change happen in ways that serve both the natural processes and the contemplative purpose of the space." In a small fishing village by the sea, there lived a fisherman named Kazuo who had developed an unusual approach to his ancient trade. Unlike other fishermen who measured the success of each day by the size of their catch and the income it provided, Kazuo had learned to find satisfaction in the quality of his effort, regardless of how many fish ended up in his nets. This had not always been his way. For many years, Kazuo had struggled with the uncertainty that is inherent in fishing. Some days the sea would provide abundant catches that fed his family well and allowed him to save money for the future. Other days he would return with empty nets despite hours of careful work, facing the disappointment of his family and the anxiety of reduced income. The unpredictability of results had made fishing feel like a constant gamble where his sense of worth and competence rose and fell with forces completely beyond his control. Good catches made him feel skilled and successful. Poor catches made him question his abilities and worry about his family's security. His mood and self-confidence became entirely dependent on outcomes he could influence but never guarantee. This attachment to results had begun to drain the deeper satisfactions that fishing could provide. Instead of appreciating the peaceful hours on the water, the skill required to read weather and currents, the meditative rhythm of casting and retrieving nets, Kazuo spent most of his time anxiously calculating whether each trip would produce sufficient catch to justify the effort. The turning point came during a particularly difficult season when weeks of poor fishing had left his family struggling financially. Kazuo was becoming increasingly desperate and frustrated, working longer hours with more intensive effort, but continuing to return home with disappointing results. The harder he tried to force good outcomes, the more elusive success seemed to become. One evening, as he sat mending nets after another unproductive day, an elderly fisherman named Grandfather Yuki approached and asked if he could offer some help with the repair work. Yuki was known throughout the village as someone who had fished these waters for over 50 years and always seemed content, regardless of how his daily catches varied. As they worked together in the gentle light of the setting sun, Grandfather Yuki made an observation that surprised Kazuo. "You fish like a man whose life depends on each catch," the old fisherman said quietly. "But I have watched you work, and your technique is excellent. Your knowledge of these waters is deep. Your equipment is well maintained. You do everything that good fishing requires. Then why do my nets come up empty so often?" Kazuo asked with frustration. "What am I doing wrong?" "Perhaps you are doing nothing wrong. Perhaps you are expecting fishing to provide something it cannot provide." "What do you mean?" "Fishing should provide fish." Grandfather Yuki smiled. "Fishing provides the opportunity to fish. Sometimes this includes fish, and sometimes it does not. But the fish are not under your control. The sea decides what it offers each day." They continued mending nets in comfortable silence while this perspective settled. Then Grandfather Yuki asked a question that would begin to transform Kazuo's relationship with his work. "What do you enjoy about fishing when you forget about the results?" Kazuo had to think carefully about this because he had become so focused on outcomes that he rarely considered the process itself. Slowly, he began to remember aspects of fishing that had drawn him to this work in the first place. "I enjoy the early morning stillness on the water," he admitted. "The way the light changes throughout the day. The skill of reading the currents and weather. The rhythm of working with the nets. The sense of participating in something much larger than myself. And do these satisfactions depend on how many fish you catch?" "No," Kazuo realized. "They exist whether the nets are full or empty." "Then perhaps you have been measuring the success of your days by the wrong standard." Over the following weeks, Grandfather Yuki shared with Kazuo a different approach to fishing that had sustained him through decades of variable catches. Instead of measuring each day by its results, the old fisherman evaluated his efforts by their quality and completeness. "I ask myself whether I have fished with full attention and appropriate skill," Grandfather Yuki explained. whether I have responded wisely to the conditions the day presented, whether I have maintained my equipment properly and treated the sea with respect. If I can answer yes to these questions, then I have succeeded regardless of what ends up in my nets. This shift in perspective felt strange to Kazuo at first. How could a day with empty nets be considered successful? But as he began to experiment with evaluating his work by process rather than results, something unexpected happened. When he focused on fishing skillfully rather than fishing successfully, his attention became more present and engaged. Instead of constantly calculating potential outcomes, he could appreciate the immediate experience of being on the water. Instead of feeling anxious about results he could not control, he could take satisfaction in efforts he could control completely. His fishing technique actually improved when he stopped being so attached to specific outcomes. With his attention fully focused on reading conditions and responding appropriately, he noticed subtle signs about weather, currents, and fish behavior that he had missed while preoccupied with worries about results. Most surprisingly, this process-focused approach seemed to improve his actual catches over time. Not because he was trying harder to catch fish, but because he was fishing with more present attention and less anxious interference. One morning, several months after his conversation with Grandfather Yuki, Kazuo experienced a profound shift in understanding. He had been fishing for hours without a single fish entering his nets, but instead of feeling frustrated or disappointed, he found himself deeply satisfied with the quality of attention he had brought to his work. The sunrise had been spectacular. The water conditions had provided interesting challenges that required skillful response. His movements with the nets had felt smooth and practiced. He had been completely present for several hours of peaceful, focused work, regardless of its external results. In that moment, Kazuo realized that he had been seeking satisfaction in the wrong place. True fulfillment came not from getting what he wanted from his work, but from giving his best effort to his work. The sea would always decide what it offered, but he could always decide what he brought to his relationship with the sea. From that day forward, Kazuo's approach to fishing transformed completely. He continued to hope for good catches and felt pleased when they occurred, but his sense of success no longer depended on them. Each day on the water became complete in itself, valuable for the quality of attention and effort it contained rather than only for its external results. His family noticed the change immediately. Instead of returning home either elated by success or dejected by failure, Kazuo came back from fishing with consistent satisfaction in his work. Even during periods of poor catches, he maintained the peaceful confidence that comes from knowing you have done your best with factors under your control. Years later, when younger fishermen would ask Kazuo about handling the uncertainties of their trade, he would share Grandfather Yuki's teaching about the difference between fishing for fish and fishing for the sake of fishing itself. "The sea gives what it gives," he would explain. "But you can always give your full attention and best effort. When you find your satisfaction there, you become free from the anxiety that comes from depending on results you cannot guarantee." In the mountains above the fishing village, there lived a scholar named Watanabe who had devoted his life to preserving ancient texts and creating commentaries that would help future students understand classical teachings. For 15 years, he had worked alone in his small study, carefully copying deteriorating manuscripts and writing detailed explanations of difficult passages. Watanabe's work was painstakingly slow and detailed. Each text required months of careful copying to ensure accuracy. Each commentary demanded extensive research and thoughtful analysis to provide genuine insight. He labored with dedication and love for the wisdom these texts contained, hoping that his efforts would serve scholars and students for generations to come. But Watanabe carried a burden that made his scholarly work feel precarious and anxious. He worried constantly about whether his efforts would ultimately prove valuable to others. Would future scholars appreciate the accuracy of his copying? Would students find his commentaries helpful for understanding difficult concepts? Would the texts he was preserving actually survive long enough to serve their intended purpose? These concerns about the ultimate value and reception of his work created a persistent underlying anxiety that interfered with the satisfaction he might have found in the work itself. Instead of losing himself in the immediate pleasure of working with beautiful ideas and precise language, Watanabe spent much of his mental energy calculating whether each project would justify the time and effort it required. The anxiety intensified whenever he heard news of political instability in the region or natural disasters that had destroyed libraries elsewhere is less than #0. 5 is greater than. What if war came to his mountain retreat and his carefully preserved manuscripts were lost? What if future generations were not interested in classical learning and his commentaries became irrelevant? What if his copying contained errors that would mislead students for centuries? These worries about hypothetical futures began to paralyze Watanabe's ability to work effectively in the present. He would sit at his writing desk, but find himself unable to concentrate on copying or analysis because his mind was occupied with fears about whether the work would ultimately matter. One autumn, Brother Ren, a traveling monk who was known for his scholarship and wisdom, visited Watanabe's mountain study and asked if he could examine some of the texts that were being preserved there. Watanabe was honored to share his work, but felt nervous about whether this respected teacher would find value in his efforts. As Brother Ren studied several of Watanabe's completed manuscripts and commentaries, his appreciation for the quality and care evident in the work was obvious. The copying was remarkably accurate, and the scholarly analysis showed deep understanding of complex philosophical concepts. "This is exceptional work," Brother Ren observed. "Your dedication to preserving these teachings is evident in every character you have written." Watanabe felt pleased by this recognition, but also compelled to share his deeper concerns. "I appreciate your kind words, Master, but I struggle with uncertainty about whether this work will ultimately serve its intended purpose. What if these texts are lost before anyone can benefit from them? What if my commentaries are not helpful to future students?" Brother Ren was quiet for a moment, considering this question carefully. Then he asked something that surprised Watanabe. "When you are completely absorbed in copying a difficult passage or analyzing a complex concept, how do you feel about the work itself?" "I feel peaceful, connected to the wisdom of the original authors, satisfied by the challenge of understanding and preserving important ideas." "And do these feelings depend on what happens to your work after you complete it?" Watanabe considered this. "No, I suppose they exist during the work itself, regardless of future outcomes." "Then you have already received the most important reward your efforts can provide." Brother Ren explained his own approach to scholarly work, which had sustained him through decades of study and teaching despite uncertainty about the ultimate impact of his efforts. "I write and teach not because I can guarantee that my work will change the world, but because engaging with wisdom changes me," the monk shared. "Each text I study deepens my understanding. Each commentary I write clarifies my thinking. Each student I teach reminds me of the value of these ideas. The value of the work exists in the doing of it, not only in its external results." This perspective began to shift something fundamental in Watanabe's relationship with his scholarly practice. Instead of working toward distant and uncertain goals, he could focus on the immediate value that engaging with classical texts provided to his own understanding and character. The preservation of wisdom is valuable whether it serves one future student or thousands, Brother Ren continued. The development of your own understanding through careful study is worthwhile whether or not anyone else ever reads your commentaries. The quality of attention you bring to this work serves the teachings themselves, regardless of how widely they spread. Over the following months, Watanabe experimented with this different motivation for his scholarly work. Instead of focusing on the potential future impact of his efforts, he concentrated on the immediate satisfaction of engaging deeply with profound ideas and preserving them accurately for whoever might encounter them. This shift had immediate effects on both the quality of his work and his enjoyment of it. When he was not anxiously calculating the future value of each project, he could give his full attention to the present task of understanding and preserving important texts. His copying became more accurate because he was completely focused on each character. His commentaries became more insightful because he was engaging with ideas for their own sake rather than trying to create something that would impress future readers. Perhaps most importantly, the work itself became deeply satisfying again rather than a source of anxiety about uncertain outcomes. Each day in his study felt complete and valuable whether or not anyone would ever benefit from the specific manuscripts he was creating. One winter morning, as Watanabe worked on a particularly challenging text about the nature of enlightenment, he experienced a moment of understanding that exemplified Brother Ren's teaching. As he wrestled with a complex passage about the relationship between effort and surrender in spiritual practice, the ideas suddenly became clear, not just intellectually, but experientially. The text was describing exactly what he was learning about his own work, how to give complete effort while releasing attachment to specific outcomes. The ancient author's insights about spiritual practice applied directly to scholarly practice, and Watanabe found himself living the wisdom he was trying to preserve and explain. In that moment, he understood that his work had already succeeded completely. By engaging seriously with these texts, he had been transformed by their wisdom. Whether or not anyone else ever read his copies or commentaries, the teachings had served their purpose by deepening his own understanding and character. From that day forward, Watanabe's approach to his scholarly work became a form of meditation and spiritual practice. Each text he copied was an opportunity to engage with profound wisdom. Each commentary he wrote was a chance to clarify his own understanding. Each day in his study was complete in itself, valuable for the quality of attention and learning it contained. Years later, when some of Watanabe's preserved texts and commentaries were discovered by a group of scholars and praised for their exceptional quality and insight, he felt pleased but not surprised. The value of the work had been evident all along to anyone willing to engage with it seriously. External recognition was gratifying, but not necessary for the work to have served its true purpose. When asked about his approach to scholarly preservation, Watanabe would share Brother Ren's teaching about finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than only in its outcomes. Wisdom serves those who engage with it sincerely, he would explain. Whether that service extends to others depends on many factors beyond our control. But the service to our own understanding and character is immediate and certain. When you find your motivation there, scholarly work becomes a source of constant satisfaction rather than anxious uncertainty. These two stories illustrate profound truths about how attachment to outcomes can undermine both the quality of our work and our satisfaction with it. Both Kazuo and Watanabe discovered that focusing on results they could not control created anxiety that interfered with their ability to perform well in areas they could control. The fisherman's transformation shows how worry about catches can prevent the present attention that makes good fishing possible. When Kazuo stopped measuring each day by its results and started evaluating his efforts by their quality, his work became more skillful and more satisfying simultaneously. Watanabe's experience reveals how concern about future impact can interfere with present engagement with meaningful work. When he learned to find value in the immediate process of studying and preserving wisdom, rather than only in its hypothetical future influence, his scholarship improved and became a source of constant fulfillment. Both stories point to the same essential insight. The most reliable source of satisfaction comes from the quality of attention and effort we bring to our work, not from the results that work produces. Zen Buddhism teaches that attachment to outcomes is one of the primary sources of human suffering. When we invest our sense of success and self-worth in results we cannot fully control, we set ourselves up for inevitable disappointment and anxiety. This attachment also interferes with our performance because it divides our attention between present tasks and future concerns. The alternative is what Buddhist texts call right action, acting with complete dedication while remaining unattached to the fruits of action. This does not mean becoming careless about results or indifferent to whether our efforts succeed. It means finding our motivation and satisfaction in the quality of our effort rather than only in its external outcomes. This approach brings several important benefits. First, it makes satisfaction possible regardless of circumstances. If you measure success only by results, you will feel successful only when things turn out as hoped. But if you measure success by the quality of your effort, you can feel successful whenever you have given your best to what you can control. Second, it often improves actual results because it allows full attention to be focused on present tasks rather than being divided between current work and future worries. Kazuo's fishing improved when he stopped being so concerned about catches. Watanabe's scholarship became more insightful when he stopped calculating its future impact. Third, it creates resilience in the face of setbacks. When you know that you have done everything within your control skillfully and completely, external failures become information rather than judgments on your worth or competence. The practice of letting go of attachment to outcomes involves learning to distinguish between caring about results and being controlled by them. You can hope for good outcomes and work toward them while recognizing that many factors beyond your influence will determine what actually happens. This distinction is crucial. Caring about results motivates skillful effort and appropriate preparation. Being attached to results creates anxiety and often interferes with the very efforts that might produce desired outcomes. In your own life, notice where attachment to specific outcomes might be creating unnecessary suffering or undermining your effectiveness. Are there areas where worry about results prevents you from fully engaging with present tasks? Are there situations where your sense of worth depends too heavily on achieving particular goals? The alternative is not to stop caring about outcomes, but to find your primary satisfaction in offering your best effort regardless of what that effort produces. Like the fisherman who learned to fish for the sake of fishing itself, you can engage with your work for the intrinsic value it provides rather than only for its external results. This approach applies to creative work, where attachment to recognition or commercial success can interfere with authentic expression. It applies to relationships, where attachment to specific responses from others can prevent genuine communication. It applies to spiritual practice, where attachment to particular experiences can block natural development. The deepest teaching in both stories is that when you act from love of the work itself rather than from need for specific outcomes, the work becomes its own reward. Kazuo found satisfaction in skillful fishing, regardless of catches. Watanabe discovered fulfillment in preserving wisdom, regardless of its future influence. This shift from external motivation to internal motivation creates sustainable satisfaction that does not depend on circumstances beyond your control. You can give your complete effort to any worthy activity while holding the results lightly, knowing that your primary purpose is already fulfilled through the quality of attention and care you bring to the work. In meditation practice, this principle appears as the teaching to sit without gaining mind. You meditate not to achieve particular states of consciousness, but to engage completely with whatever arises in awareness. This same attitude can guide all activities, engaging fully while remaining unattached to specific outcomes. As your breathing naturally deepens and your body settles into rest, notice how the breath serves life perfectly without any concern for results or achievement. Each breath is complete in itself, serving its purpose through the simple act of breathing rather than through any external accomplishment. We arrive now at the deepest territory of letting go, the release that touches the very foundation of how we understand ourselves. The boundaries we draw between self and other, between inside and outside, between what we are and what we are not. The illusion of separation that creates so much unnecessary suffering and blinds us to our true nature. Tonight, we explore the most profound teaching of Zen wisdom. How the small self that we protect so carefully is itself a construction that can be gently released. How beneath the ego's constant concerns about its survival and status lies a deeper identity that is already whole, already connected, already free. Through stories of those who discovered their true nature beyond personal boundaries, we will find that the greatest letting go is the recognition that there was never anything separate to hold on to in the first place. In a remote valley where few travelers ventured, there lived a hermit named Soshin who had withdrawn from human society 15 years earlier to pursue spiritual practice in solitude. He had built a simple hut beside a mountain stream, created a small garden for vegetables, and established a daily routine of meditation, study, and contemplative work that filled his days with purposeful activity. Soshin had chosen the hermit's path because he believed that isolation from others was necessary for achieving the deep spiritual insights he sought. In the village where he had previously lived, he had found himself constantly distracted by social obligations, other people's problems, and the complex web of relationships that seemed to pull his attention away from inner development. Living alone in the mountains, Soshin felt he could finally focus completely on understanding the nature of mind and reality without external interference. He spent hours each day in meditation, studying classical texts about enlightenment and practicing various techniques designed to dissolve the ego and reveal his true nature. But after 15 years of intensive solitary practice, Soshin had begun to feel stuck rather than progressively enlightened. Despite his dedicated efforts, he still experienced the same sense of being a separate self, struggling to achieve something beyond his current state. The peace he occasionally touched in deep meditation seemed to evaporate as soon as he returned to daily activities. The insights he gained from reading spiritual texts remained intellectual rather than transforming his actual experience of life. Most troubling, Soshin had begun to notice that his years of isolation had not eliminated self-concern, but had simply refined it. Instead of worrying about social success or material security, he now worried about spiritual progress and meditative attainment. Instead of competing with others for worldly achievements, he was competing with his own expectations about enlightenment. The ego he was trying to transcend had simply adopted spiritual goals instead of mundane ones. One spring morning, as Soshin sat in meditation beside the stream that flowed past his hut, he became aware of an unusual sound in the distance. Someone was calling for help, and the voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the mountain path that occasionally brought lost travelers through his valley. Soshin's first impulse was to ignore the disturbance and continue his practice. He had worked hard to create an environment free from such interruptions, and he felt annoyed that his meditation was being disrupted by someone else's problem. But the calling continued, and it was clear that whoever was out there was in genuine distress. Reluctantly, Soshin emerged from his meditation and followed the sound to discover an elderly man who had fallen beside the rocky path and injured his leg badly enough that he could not continue walking. The traveler was clearly exhausted and in considerable pain, and it was evident that he needed immediate help to avoid serious danger. Without thinking, Soshin found himself completely focused on assessing the man's condition and determining what assistance was needed. He helped the injured traveler to his hut, cleaned and bandaged the wounded leg, provided food and water, and created a comfortable place for the man to rest while his injury healed. For the next several days, as Soshin cared for his unexpected guest, something extraordinary happened to his sense of self and his spiritual practice. The constant self-monitoring that had characterized his solitary meditation disappeared completely. There was no one watching his performance or evaluating his progress. There was simply the immediate reality of another person's needs and his natural response to meet those needs. The injured traveler, whose name was Master Hote, turned out to be a wandering monk with decades of experience in Zen practice. As he recovered, he observed Soshin's approach to caregiving with quiet appreciation, but also with recognition of something the hermit had not yet noticed about his own transformation. You are a very different person when you are helping someone than when you are trying to help yourself, Master Hote observed one evening as they shared tea beside the fire. This comment puzzled Soshin. What do you mean? When you were caring for my injury, did you worry about whether you were doing it correctly? Did you judge yourself for not being more skillful? Did you compare your performance to some ideal standard of caregiving? Soshin thought about this. No, I was simply responding to what needed to be done. And when you meditate alone, seeking spiritual attainment, how does your mind operate? I often worry about whether I'm making progress. I judge my experiences. I compare my current state to where I think I should be. Do you see the difference? Gradually, Soshin began to understand what Master Hote was pointing out. When he was focused on helping someone else, the self-conscious self that usually dominated his experience simply disappeared. There was no separate Soshin trying to achieve something or protect something or improve something. There was just natural response to immediate need. But when he was practicing spiritual techniques designed to eliminate the ego, that very practice reinforced the sense of there being someone who needed to eliminate something. The effort to transcend the small self actually strengthened the identity of being someone with a small self to transcend. True selflessness, Master Hote explained, does not come from trying to get rid of the self. It emerges naturally when attention is completely absorbed in what actually needs to be done. You cannot practice selflessness as a technique, because practicing it requires someone to practice it. Over the following days, as Master Hotei's leg healed and he prepared to continue his journey, he shared with Soshin a different understanding of spiritual practice that would transform the hermit's entire approach to awakening. The small self is not an entity that needs to be destroyed, the monk explained. It is a mental habit that dissolves naturally when it is not being reinforced. Like a shadow that disappears when you stop standing between the light and the wall. This insight began to shift everything about Soshin's relationship with his practice and his understanding of enlightenment. Instead of working to eliminate his ego, he could simply stop feeding it with constant self-concern. Instead of trying to achieve selflessness, he could allow it to emerge through genuine engagement with life as it presented itself. When Master Hotei had recovered sufficiently to resume his travels, he made a suggestion that initially shocked Soshin. Perhaps it is time for you to return to the world. Not because solitude is wrong, but because you have learned what isolation can teach you. The next stage of your practice may require the presence of others. The idea of leaving his mountain retreat felt terrifying to Soshin. For 15 years, he had defined himself as someone who had transcended the need for human society. His identity as a serious spiritual practitioner was built around his commitment to solitary practice. But Master Hotei's presence had shown him something he could not have discovered alone. The deepest spiritual experiences of his life had occurred not during isolated meditation, but during moments of complete absorption in caring for another person. The selflessness he had been seeking through techniques designed to eliminate the ego had emerged naturally through simple service. Several months after Master Hotei continued his journey, Soshin made the difficult decision to leave his mountain hermitage and return to human community. Not to abandon spiritual practice, but to discover what practice looked like when it included, rather than excluded, the world of relationships and mutual interdependence. The transition was challenging because it required releasing an identity he had cultivated for 15 years. He was no longer Soshin the hermit. Pursuing enlightenment in mountain solitude was simply someone learning to live with awareness and compassion in whatever circumstances life presented. But this release of spiritual identity paradoxically deepened rather than diminished his actual spiritual development. When he stopped trying to be someone special who had achieved something extraordinary, he could respond naturally to ordinary moments with the same presence and care he had discovered while helping Master Hotei. Years later, when students would ask Soshin about his time as a hermit and his eventual return to community life, he would share Master Hotei's teaching about the difference between practicing selflessness and allowing selflessness to emerge naturally. I spent 15 years trying to transcend the ego through various techniques and disciplines, he would explain. But the ego that was trying to transcend itself was still the ego. Real transcendence happened not through effort, but through forgetting myself completely in service to what actually needed attention. The small self disappeared not because I destroyed it, but because I stopped feeding it with constant concern about its spiritual progress. Soshin's story reveals something profound about the nature of spiritual seeking and the paradox of trying to eliminate the ego through effort. His 15 years of solitary practice had actually strengthened the very sense of being a separate self that he was trying to transcend. Each meditation session, each spiritual technique, each moment of self-evaluation reinforced the identity of being someone who practices and someone who seeks enlightenment. The breakthrough came not through more intensive practice, but through complete absorption in caring for another person. When Master Hotei needed help, Soshin's usual self-consciousness disappeared naturally because his attention was entirely focused on immediate needs rather than on his own spiritual development. This illustrates the Zen teaching that the ego cannot destroy itself through its own efforts. Like trying to lift yourself by pulling on your own shoelaces, the attempt to eliminate the self through self-directed practice often reinforces the very sense of separation it seeks to dissolve. True selflessness emerges not through effort, but through the natural forgetting of self that occurs when awareness is completely absorbed in what actually requires attention. The hermit's isolation had served a purpose in developing concentration and understanding, but it had also created an artificial separation from the very interconnectedness that spiritual practice ultimately reveals. Master Hotei's presence showed Soshin that enlightenment is not something achieved in isolation, but something that emerges through genuine engagement with life as it actually appears, including its relationships and responsibilities. In another mountain region, there lived a bridge builder named Takeshi, who had dedicated his career to creating safe passage across rivers and gorges that had previously isolated communities from each other. His work required tremendous skill in engineering, careful attention to terrain and weather conditions, and the ability to coordinate complex construction projects that often took years to complete. Takeshi took great pride in his bridges, each of which represented a unique solution to the particular challenges presented by a specific landscape and community need. He would spend months studying a site before beginning design work, considering not only technical requirements, but also how each bridge would serve the people who would use it for generations to come. But Takeshi had developed a relationship with his work that created unnecessary suffering despite his obvious competence and dedication. He had begun to see each bridge as an extension of his personal identity, a monument to his skill and creativity that would preserve his reputation long after his death. This attachment to his bridges as expressions of his ego made Takeshi increasingly anxious about their fate. He would revisit completed projects frequently to check on their condition, worrying about whether natural forces or human changes might compromise their integrity or usefulness. He felt personally wounded when flood or earthquake damaged his constructions, as if the injury to the bridge were an injury to himself. The identification with his work had become so strong that Takeshi measured his own worth by the success and durability of his bridges. When a bridge he had built served a community well and stood strong against weather and time, he felt validated and significant. When problems arose with his constructions, he felt diminished and questioned his competence despite decades of successful projects. This ego attachment was affecting not only Takeshi's peace of mind, but also his effectiveness as a bridge builder. Instead of designing each project to serve immediate community needs optimally, he found himself making choices based on how impressive or lasting they would make his personal legacy appear. He would sometimes add unnecessary complexity to designs to demonstrate his engineering sophistication. He would choose materials and methods that would preserve his bridges longer, even when simpler approaches would serve community needs better. His focus on creating monuments to his skill was interfering with his ability to create purely functional solutions to transportation problems. One autumn, Takeshi was commissioned to build a bridge across a wide river that flooded unpredictably and had prevented reliable trade between two prosperous towns. The technical challenges were significant, but Takeshi was confident in his ability to design a structure that would withstand the worst floods while providing safe passage during normal conditions. As he studied the site and began developing his design, Takeshi found himself thinking not only about engineering requirements, but about how this bridge would be regarded as the masterpiece of his career. It would be his largest and most technically sophisticated project, crossing the widest span he had ever attempted with innovative features that would demonstrate his mastery of advanced construction techniques. But as work progressed, the river began to teach Takeshi something that would transform his understanding of his role as a bridge builder. During his months of observing the waterway, he noticed that its character changed constantly with seasons, weather, and the various activities of communities along its banks. Sometimes the river flowed gently, providing a peaceful boundary between the towns that people could cross easily in small boats. Sometimes it became a raging torrent that made any crossing dangerous, regardless of bridge design. Sometimes it froze solid enough that people could walk across without any constructed aid. Sometimes it nearly dried up, leaving only a shallow stream that barely required a footbridge. Watching these constant changes, Takeshi began to see that the river was not a static obstacle to be permanently conquered by human engineering. It was a living system that expressed different needs and possibilities through its natural cycles. A bridge that served this dynamic system well would need to work with these changes rather than simply imposing a fixed solution. This insight began to shift Takeshi's approach to his design work. Instead of creating a monument to his engineering prowess that would dominate the landscape, he began to envision a bridge that would serve the river as well as the communities it connected. He simplified his design, eliminating features that demonstrated technical sophistication but did not serve actual function. He chose materials and construction methods that would allow the bridge to age gracefully and integrate naturally with its environment, rather than standing as a permanent assertion of human control over natural forces. Most significantly, Takeshi found that as he focused on serving the relationship between river and communities, rather than on creating a testament to his own skill, his personal attachment to the project began to dissolve. He was no longer building Takeshi's bridge, but simply building a bridge that would serve whoever needed to cross this particular river. The change in his approach was noticed immediately by the workers and community members involved in the construction. Instead of demanding that every detail conform to his personal vision, Takeshi became open to suggestions and modifications that would serve practical needs better. Instead of treating the bridge as his creation to be protected and admired, he began to see it as a gift he was offering to the relationship between places and people. One morning, as construction neared completion and Takeshi stood watching the sun rise over the nearly finished bridge, he experienced a moment of recognition that would change his understanding of his work and himself permanently. Looking at the bridge in the morning light, he suddenly saw that it was not separate from the river it crossed or the landscape it occupied. The stones came from nearby quarries. The wood came from local forests. The design was shaped by the river's character and the community's needs. Even his own engineering knowledge was something he had received from teachers and experience rather than something he had created independently. In that moment, Takeshi realized that he had never built anything alone. Every bridge was the result of countless contributions from other people, natural systems, and accumulated human knowledge. His role was not to create monuments to his individual skill, but to serve as one element in a complex collaboration between human needs and natural possibilities. This recognition dissolved his attachment to his bridges, not through effort or spiritual technique, but through simple recognition of how things actually worked. There was no separate Takeshi who owned his constructions any more than there was a separate river that owned its water or a separate forest that owned its trees. From that day forward, Takeshi's approach to bridge building became a form of meditation on interdependence rather than a means of expressing personal achievement. Each project became an opportunity to serve the natural collaboration between human communities and landscape features rather than to impose his individual will on resistant materials. His bridges became more beautiful and functional because they emerged from this collaborative understanding rather than from ego-driven design. Communities appreciated his work more because they could sense that his bridges served their actual needs rather than his personal ambitions. Years later, when apprentice engineers would ask Takeshi about developing skill in bridge building, he would share what the river had taught him about the difference between building to serve the ego and building to serve life itself. The best bridges disappear into their function, he would explain. People cross them without thinking about the builder because they feel like natural parts of the landscape. When you design from ego, you create monuments that call attention to the engineer. When you design from service, you create passages that serve their purpose so well that they become invisible. These two stories reveal the deepest truth about letting go of the small self. Both Soshin and Takeshi discovered that the ego they had been trying to manage or transcend was not actually a solid entity, but a process of identification that could simply be discontinued. The hermit's experience shows how the effort to eliminate the ego can actually reinforce it. When Soshin was trying to achieve selflessness through spiritual practice, he was strengthening the identity of being someone who needed to achieve something. But when he was naturally absorbed in caring for Master Hote, selflessness emerged without effort because there was no separate self to maintain or improve. Both stories point to the same insight. The small self is maintained by attention and dissolved by lack of attention. Like a fire that dies when you stop feeding it fuel, the ego disappears when you stop feeding it with self-concern. In a mountain temple where monks maintained continuous prayer and meditation, there lived an aging master named Teacher Aisho, who had spent 50 years guiding students in the ways of Zen practice. Though his body had grown frail with advanced age, his understanding of spiritual principles had deepened into a wisdom that touched everyone who encountered his gentle presence. Teacher Aisho knew that his time in this life was drawing to a close, and he wanted to share with his final students the most essential teaching he had discovered through decades of practice and observation. But this teaching could not be conveyed through words alone. It had to be demonstrated through the way he met each day and each night with complete acceptance and trust. The students who gathered around Teacher Aisho during his final months noticed something remarkable about his approach to daily life. Despite his physical frailty and awareness of approaching death, he maintained a quality of peace and contentment that seemed to deepen rather than diminish as his condition grew more fragile. Each evening, as darkness fell and the time came for rest, Teacher Aisho would perform a simple ritual that became a profound teaching for anyone who observed it. He would sit quietly for a few minutes, releasing any concerns or unfinished business from the day. Then, he would lie down with the same trustful surrender that a child shows when exhaustion naturally leads to sleep. But what struck his students most deeply was the complete absence of anxiety about whether he would wake up the next morning. Teacher Aisho approached each night's sleep as a practice of ultimate letting go, releasing not only the day's experiences, but also any attachment to continuing in his present form. One of his students, a young monk named Jishin, found this equanimity in the face of mortality both inspiring and puzzling. After observing Teacher Aisho's peaceful approach to sleep for several weeks, Jishin asked if he could understand the source of such profound trust. "Master, I notice that you go to sleep each night as if you have no concern about whether you will survive until morning. How do you maintain such peace when death might come at any time?" Teacher Aisho smiled gently. Tell me, Jishin, what happens to yesterday's thoughts when you fall asleep? They disappear. Sleep dissolves them completely. And what happens to today's Jishin when you enter deep sleep? Jishin considered this carefully. I suppose the sense of being me disappears during deep sleep. There's no awareness of identity or personal concerns. And yet, you wake up each morning. What returns? Awareness returns. The sense of being alive and conscious comes back. But is the awareness that wakes up exactly the same as the awareness that went to sleep? This question made Jishin pause. He realized that while consciousness returned each morning, it was not exactly identical to the previous day's consciousness. Each day brought slightly different thoughts, feelings, and perspectives. The person who woke up was both the same and different from the person who had gone to sleep. I think awareness returns renewed and changed, Jishin admitted. Exactly. So you have been practicing death and rebirth every night of your life without realizing it. Sleep is your daily teacher in the art of letting go and trusting what emerges naturally. Teacher Aisho explained how he had come to see sleep as the most profound spiritual practice available to human beings. Each night offered an opportunity to practice complete surrender of personal identity and trust in the natural processes that sustain life beyond individual consciousness. When you go to sleep, Teacher Aisho continued, you let go of everything you think you are. Your name, your concerns, your plans, your fears, all dissolve into unconsciousness. Yet life continues. Your body heals and restores itself. Your mind processes and integrates the day's experiences. All of this happens without any effort or control from the you that goes to sleep. This perspective began to transform Jishin's relationship with both sleep and death. Instead of seeing sleep as a temporary interruption of life, he began to understand it as a nightly practice of the ultimate surrender that death would eventually require. Each evening became an opportunity to practice releasing attachment to personal identity and trusting the larger life that continues beyond individual consciousness. Teacher Aisho guided his students in approaching sleep as a conscious spiritual practice. Instead of simply falling asleep from exhaustion, they learned to surrender into rest with the same intentional letting go that they brought to meditation and other spiritual disciplines. As you prepare for sleep, Teacher Aisho would instruct them, spend a few moments releasing the day. Let go of any regrets about what happened. Release any worries about what tomorrow might bring. Then surrender your personal identity as trustfully as you surrender your body to the bed that supports it. The students who practiced this approach to sleep found that it deepened both their rest and their spiritual understanding. Sleep became a daily opportunity to practice the ultimate letting go rather than simply a biological necessity. Each morning brought a sense of renewal that came not just from physical rest, but from the spiritual practice of surrendering personal identity and trusting larger forces. One evening, several months before Teacher Aisho's death, he shared with his gathered students what he considered his final and most important teaching. As the sun set and the time for rest approached, he spoke about the relationship between daily sleep and the ultimate sleep that awaits every living being. Each night you practice dying, he said softly. Each morning you practice being born. Life is a continuous rhythm of holding and releasing, appearing and disappearing, individual consciousness and universal awareness. When you learn to sleep well, you learn to die well. When you learn to die well, you learn to live well. The students sat in deep silence as this teaching settled. Teacher Aisho's words pointed to something that could only be understood through direct experience rather than intellectual analysis. Do not fear the great sleep that will eventually come, Teacher Aisho continued. It is the same rest you have been practicing every night of your life. The awareness that wakes up each morning from sleep is the same awareness that continues beyond the end of individual life. Trust in this continuity. Rest in this understanding. Several months later, Teacher Aisho died peacefully in his sleep, demonstrating through his final act the ultimate teaching he had been sharing with his students. His death felt like a natural completion rather than a tragic ending because he had prepared for it through years of nightly practice in the art of conscious surrender. Years later, when Jishin had become a teacher himself and worked with students who struggled with fear of death or difficulty with sleep, he would share Teacher Aisho's understanding of sleep as spiritual practice. Each night offers you the opportunity to practice the ultimate letting go, he would explain. Sleep teaches you that consciousness can surrender completely and still return renewed. Death is simply the final sleep from which consciousness awakens in a different form. When you learn to trust the process of nightly rest, you develop faith in the larger process of which individual life is just one cycle. Teacher Aisho's final teaching reveals the deepest truth about letting go. Sleep is not separate from spiritual practice, but is perhaps its most essential form. Each night, we practice releasing everything we think we are and trusting the natural processes that sustain life beyond personal control. The aging master's peaceful approach to mortality shows how the daily practice of conscious surrender into sleep prepares us for the ultimate surrender that death requires. When we learn to let go completely each night, death becomes not a fearful unknown, but a familiar process we have been practicing throughout our lives. This perspective transforms both sleep and death from enemies to be fought into teachers to be embraced. Sleep becomes an opportunity for daily renewal through conscious surrender. Death becomes the final letting go that allows consciousness to continue in new forms beyond individual limitation. These two stories weave together the ultimate teaching about letting go. Both Kenjiro and Teacher Aisho discovered that true peace comes not from controlling consciousness, but from trusting its natural rhythms of alertness and rest, effort and surrender, individual awareness, and universal consciousness. The Night Guard's learning shows us that even necessary vigilance can be performed from a state of relaxed trust rather than anxious effort. When we stop fighting against our natural rhythms and learn to work with them, both wakefulness and rest become expressions of the same underlying awareness. Teacher Aisho's final teaching reveals how sleep serves as daily preparation for the ultimate letting go. Each night, we practice releasing personal identity and trusting the processes that sustain life beyond individual consciousness. This nightly rehearsal develops the faith and skill needed for the final surrender that death requires. Together, these stories point to the deepest wisdom of Zen Buddhism about the nature of consciousness and the practice of letting go. Awareness itself is already perfect and does not need to be improved, controlled, or maintained through effort. Our role is simply to trust its natural functioning and cooperate with its rhythms rather than fighting against them. In meditation, this means allowing awareness to be naturally alert rather than forcing concentration. In daily life, this means responding appropriately to what each moment requires rather than trying to control outcomes. In sleep, this means surrendering personal identity trustfully rather than clinging to wakefulness. In death, this means releasing individual form while trusting the continuity of consciousness in its larger expressions. The practice of letting go ultimately leads to this recognition There is nothing separate to release because individual consciousness has always been part of universal awareness. The small self that seems to need protection and improvement is a temporary formation within consciousness, like a wave that appears to be separate from the ocean, but is actually nothing other than ocean expressing itself in wave form. When this understanding becomes lived experience rather than intellectual knowledge, all forms of letting go become natural rather than difficult. You can release control because there was never anyone separate to control anything. You can surrender outcomes because individual will has always been part of larger intelligence. You can let go of others' opinions because the self that seemed to need approval was never actually separate from the universal consciousness that includes all perspectives. This is why sleep is such a profound teacher. Each night, the wave of individual consciousness dissolves back into the ocean of universal awareness, and each morning it emerges renewed. But the ocean itself never changes, never sleeps, never dies. The awareness within which personal consciousness appears and disappears is already eternal, already perfect, already free. As your breath naturally slows and your body settles into the position that calls to it for rest, notice how letting go is already happening without any effort from you. Your muscles are releasing their tension. Your thoughts are becoming quieter and less insistent. Your sense of being someone who needs to accomplish something is gently dissolving. This is not something you are doing. This is something that is happening through you as part of the natural rhythm that governs all life. The same intelligence that beats your heart and digests your food is now preparing your consciousness for the daily practice of surrender that sleep provides. You do not need to know how to sleep any more than you need to know how to grow your hair or heal a cut finger. The wisdom that governs these processes operates far beyond personal understanding or control. Your only task is to cooperate with what wants to happen naturally rather than interfering with unnecessary effort or worry. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice letting go in all its forms. New chances to release control and trust natural processes. New invitations to surrender attachment and discover the freedom that comes from holding everything lightly. But tonight, the only practice needed is the one your body and mind already know how to perform perfectly. Let your breathing find its own deepest rhythm. Allow your thoughts to come and go, like clouds passing through an empty sky. Release any need to monitor your progress towards sleep or evaluate how well you are relaxing. These concerns belong to the waking mind that is already beginning to dissolve into the vast awareness that never sleeps because it never needs to wake up. Rest in this understanding that letting go is not something you achieve, but something you allow. Sleep is not something you create, but something you surrender into. Peace is not something you attain, but something you discover was always here, waiting beneath the layers of effort, and seeking that once seemed so necessary, but are now revealed as simply unnecessary additions to what is already complete. The ultimate letting go is the recognition that there was never anything to hold on to in the first place. Individual consciousness has always been universal consciousness expressing itself temporarily in personal form. The fears, desires, struggles, and achievements that once seemed so important are simply weather patterns moving through the sky of awareness that remains forever unchanged, forever vast, forever peacefully present. Tonight, let yourself dissolve into this vast presence that is your true nature. Let the small self that carried the day's concerns melt like ice returning to water. Trust the great rhythm of appearing and disappearing, effort and rest, individual expression and universal peace that has been carrying you through every moment of your life without ever needing your permission or assistance. Sleep well, knowing that the awareness within which sleep appears is the same awareness within which all of life unfolds. Dream peacefully, trusting that even in dreams you remain held by the unchanging presence that is both your deepest identity and the source of all that arises and passes away. And when you wake tomorrow, refreshed and renewed, you will carry with you the deep knowing that letting go is not loss, but homecoming. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.